Hi, Don. Welcome to the show. Can you tell me a bit about your punk pseudonym, Reuben Kincade? Where does the name come from, and how did you pick it, or how did it get assigned to you? Because nicknames are usually not always picked.
No, it was assigned. I'm really happy to be here, guys. This is fantastic. Originally, when I started promoting, I came up with it was called Killing Zone Productions. It sounded punk, right? It sounded kind of hardcore. And the guys in Hype were like, "No, that's too typical punk." And so they said, "You're like Reuben Kincade in the Partridge Family. You're our manager." And so they said, "You're Reuben Kincade Productions," and then it kind of went from there. And so I was like, "Okay, that's it. That's how it all started."
Yeah. Often nicknames are chosen for you.
Old Rube.
Yeah. So it has he was the manager of the Partridge Family, right? And what part of Toronto did you grow up in?
I grew up in Oakville in the latter part of like the teen years. But before that, I was all over Canada, so we moved constantly.
Oh, okay.
Born in Montreal, lived out in Calgary, Kitchener, Mississauga, all over the place.
That explains a little bit about because in reading some things about you, there's you have a very pro-Canadiana feel to you, and maybe it has something to do with having lived in many places.
Well, and even the logo for the production company has a Canadian flag, right?
Yeah, I was very pro-Canadian, proud of Canada, so.
Yeah.
Faults and all.
What was it like to grow up in Oakville?
Well, I'm not sure about growing up. I mean, I guess I was 19 when we moved into Oakville from Calgary, so it was a pretty quiet place.
Is that where you got into punk, or did you get into punk early?
That's sort of where I got into punk. I mean, I really wasn't into music at all, and no genre of music really touched me. I just really was agnostic to it. I couldn't care less. And I remember I was out in Calgary one time, and me and my friends were driving out to Montana on a road trip, and there was this song that came on the radio from this faraway radio station, and it was this song that just grabbed me, and I was like, what is this? And it was this song, I ain't half glad it's Friday night, I want to get my fish and chips tonight. I didn't know what the heck that was, but it was the only song that ever actually sort of reached me. And for years I didn't know what it was. Eventually I found out it was Eddie and the Hot Rods, one of the sort of quasi-pub punk bands in the UK. And when I got into Oakville, it was London Calling. When I first heard London Calling, that changed everything for me. It was like, oh my God, what is that song? What is that band? And I started, getting into the Clash very heavily. The Clash led you to the Sex Pistols, Damned, Buzzcocks, Stiff Little Fingers, and then on to Dead Kennedys. I mean, it just explodes. One album, you'd buy an album, and you'd see the thanks to, and it would lead you to a whole new bunch of albums that you wanted to check out.
Yeah, and
that's how it all happened.
Was there much of a scene in Oakville?
No, not much of a scene per se. So in the south end it was sort of the Hype crew, and then in the north end was the Negative Gain guys. There was a band before Negative Gain and Hype called Section 8. I heard the tape. They were very good, sort of ahead of their time back then. I think they did some shows in Oakville. Not a lot of activity in Oakville, but the punks would all get together for parties. So that's sort of how it went. We'd all go into Toronto for shows. And
let me ask you about why the punks would get together for parties, because I often think about this in my own context. I think of like going to high school dances and sort of like they would not ever play punk music, and even if you tried to suggest it, but like if you found some like-minded people into the same subculture and same music, and you had a party, you just sort of gravitated.
Yeah,
towards.
you click.
Was that the same in Oakville?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I remember our first ever live show actually was a Battle of the Bands at this Purdue High School in Oakville. And so they didn't know what to expect. And here comes Hype, and we had John Gill with us, who was like 6'20", giant mohawk, and all the kids were like, oh my God, who are these guys? And they went up and ripped it out, and we actually played with Jeff Healey. He played as well, and because he was sort of friends with Brian, and he would come into our rehearsal studio sometimes. This is
Brian Bishop, the singer?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, we didn't win, obviously. Neither did Jeff Healey, and we were like,
That's crazy.
This is
Neither of you.
BS. He should have won. I mean, come on, he's Jeff Healey, for God's sakes.
Yeah, for sure, yeah.
That's funny crazy.
It's interesting.
Negative Gain had the same kind of experience where they were doing the high school Battle of the Bands. There's a photo I've seen of Steve, and I think it was about 1984 or something like that. And at White Oaks Secondary. Yeah. Yep. So they had a similar kind of thing where that seemed to be a thing that happened. I don't really remember punk bands playing at my high school, unfortunately, but I think we had maybe some metal bands though.
It was, it was your way of fighting the system, standing up. And in Oakville, I mean, it's certainly in Toronto, I guess, to some degree, but back then in Oakville, it was dangerous being a punk. You didn't go anywhere alone. You were always in a group. And so even if you went into the 7-Eleven, you made sure that everybody knew that there were buddies there because, I mean, punk rock was not exactly accepted back then.
Yeah, no, I mean, I had a similar experience. And I also think of the first wave. So I convinced the Todd Rundgren band to do Should I Stay or Should I Go, which is how I got to be in a first band. And it was a high school battle of the bands. But I also remember the first wave of the punk scene talking about, like Teenage Head talking about how there was a circuit for high school dances, and they sort of got into that and started playing high schools.
Yep.
And then I think that then it became Battle of the Bands. So it was like, let's give kids an opportunity. And I think these Battle of the Bands were sort of a chance for people to get up on the stage. Even it was very limited, like you played only for 1 or 2 songs, I think. Was that?
Yeah, it was like about 3 songs and then
so you'd give it your all for sure, right?
Yep. Oh, yeah.
Because you had to make an impact, and definitely as a punk band or a hardcore band, you weren't really going up there to win.
No.
You were just going up there to play.
You were just flying the flag. That was it.
Yeah, for sure.
3 songs lasted about, what, a minute and a half?
Yeah, about that.
There was also, was there a band called, you mentioned Section 8 from Oakville?
Yeah, and Zero Option.
Was there a band called Zero Option from there?
Yeah.
Oh, they were on the BYO comp.
Yep.
Ah.
I love that song, Real Politics.
Yeah, they're amazing. Do you know anything about
No, I didn't know anything about them. Never met anybody from Zero Option. Ran into some of the guys from Section 8 at a party a few times, but that was kind of just before our time.
Okay. Did you ever, Grant told me about a band called Wave the Flag, Grant Slavin from Negative Gain. Did you remember them? Recall?
Nope,
Okay.
never heard of them. But wasn't that a Negative Gain song?
Well, he said that they were a huge influence on him, so I wouldn't doubt it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Nope, don't know.
So what was the Toronto scene like? Was there, it doesn't sound like there was enough of a scene to be doing a lot of shows out there. Did you, I mean, you're talking about a battle of bands, and was there any other spaces that bands from Oakville could play, or did you have to gravitate to Toronto?
You had to gravitate to Toronto. So, I mean, we ultimately ended up doing a couple of all-age hall shows in Oakville, which were some
initially?
Yeah. Well, along the way, actually, when we brought the stretch marks in, I brought Direct Action in. But mostly you had to go to Toronto. And so when we first started, which really drove the whole DIY Reuben Kincade thing going forward, when we first went out to the Turning Point to figure out, okay, how do we get to play a show? And so we didn't know at that point that the Young Lions, Youth, United States had all expired. So we didn't know that the sort of the main body of punk at that time had essentially died almost all at one time. And we went to the Turning Point, talked to a few people, and they said, well, you should talk to Brian Taylor at the Record Peddler. So I go to the Record Peddler, talk to Brian. He really didn't know what the hell I was talking about, to be honest with you. He didn't really help me at all. I don't know what I expected from him. I was a little disappointed, but in retrospect, what the heck was he supposed to do for us? He's just a guy, and he points me back. You got to talk to the manager of the band and the manager of the club and book a show. Nobody was just going to do it for you.
Yeah,
but I didn't understand that. So I go back to the Turning Point, talk to the manager, book a show. And book the first show, hardly anybody shows up, and then you just keep at it. And
so I was reading in I think it was the Still Thinking interview, or it might have been a Pirates of Doom interview. There was this is the chicken or the egg question: which came first, Hype or Reuben Kincade? And
Hype.
Yeah, that's what I understood. So Hype had played a few shows before you actually started getting involved. Is that the case?
Well, I was always with them. I mean, we were a close bunch of friends, a lot of brothers all together, and I mean brothers like in siblings,
like blood brothers.
Yes, and so they had been jamming and playing for a long time, doing a lot of covers and whatnot. And then, like I said, we did the Battle of the Bands thing, and then we played our first Turning Point show. And Reuben Kincade really came out after the first couple of shows. So, I did a few Killing Zone production things, and then we realized I needed to take control of what was going to happen and really chart our own destiny and start booking our own shows.
So Killing Zone was the first name that you were using, right?
Yeah, and it was on a couple of flyers, and after that it became Reuben Kincade from there on.
So you were managing Hype from the beginning.
Only because I had no other role, because I tried to be the singer. That didn't work. I tried to be the drummer. Nobody knew how to play anything except for Sheen. He was the only one that knew how to play an instrument. So literally, Hype, as good as they ended up being, nobody knew how to play an instrument.
initially.
So you drew the short straw and got to manage.
If you can't do anything, you manage.
Yeah, so then you managed. So you started managing the band right out of the gate.
Yep.
But then you figured that to get onto shows, maybe put on your own shows, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Otherwise, you're you have to wait and hope that somebody's going to book you, which I think ultimately that was an ethos that I took forward because I wanted to make sure the bands had a chance, like we never had at the beginning, to get on a show. Because, Jill put on, I love Jill, no mistake, but she put on some of the older shows and more of the high-profile acts locally. I wanted to give the smaller bands a chance to get on a bill and pay them, I think, hopefully, appropriately, because I think some of them were surprised at what they were getting paid. Sometimes you get $25, maybe a few beers at the bar or whatnot. But if you start paying an opening band $100, $250, they're like, wow, well, I know what it's like because I'm doing it for hype. So that was the kind of an idea, and eventually you get to a point where you see there are certain local bands that should and deserve to be headliners in their own right, like Sudden Impact and Problem Children. No respect to anybody else, but I could see early on those two bands deserved to be headliners, and they had a big future ahead of them.
Yeah, and then it also gives people, it's not just opportunity, but resources. So you're talking about the resources side and also opportunity to get on these bills, and then you start developing a scene, right? Let me ask you about, so we mentioned something about the first hype show a little bit. You'd mentioned about some shows in Oakville. Do you recall when that was?
I think, I don't know why 84 jumps to mind, but I know we did a big show in Oakville where I rented out a hall, sound system, the whole thing, and that's when I brought in the Stretch Marks from Winnipeg, and they played Toronto, and then they played in Oakville, I think the following day on a Sunday.
So this is a show, I'm looking at a Stretch Marks show here, which is 1984, and I can't remember the date of this now, but
if it's Hardcore Night, that would be a Sunday.
Yeah.
So maybe I had the Saturday show in I know I had them back to back, so I had
October 7th.
Yeah. So this would be a Sunday night if it was a Hardcore Night at Larry's. So I must have been a Saturday in Oakville, and it was packed because I had Stretch Marks, Direct Action, Hype, Negative Gain, and I think another local band out of Burlington. But that was a big deal to get Stretch Marks and Direct Action to come into Oakville.
But let me ask you about this one, because this one predates it. This is a show on August 24th in Toronto. It's at the Bagdesh Temple, which had a limited life. I think it initially sort of was broken in by the Start Dancing folks. This used to be a Jewish temple, and then it became sort of a community space. And I don't know. Do you guys recall anything about this Youth Brigade show?
No.
Do you know anything about the show?
I don't.
So it happens like at least a month, August, September, October, 2 months before.
Okay.
I wanted to ask you about this band here, T.O. Hardcore Clones, which says Ex-Youth, Youth, Dead End, Young Lions. It looks like it was sort of like an amalgam, all-star, one-off kind of thing. Do you know
never
that?
heard of them, and certainly Hype was not on the bill, like the Hype that I know.
Okay.
I wonder, because I remember when I first met Buzz from APB at the Turning Point when we had first started doing shows, he mentioned another band called Hype.
This is a different Hype.
Yeah, and I think they were more of maybe a new wavy type thing, but maybe that's who they are, but it wasn't us.
Oh, okay. Because I thought Jill did the show too, and I was thinking,
because at that point, at that point, I wouldn't even have
connection.
known Jill.
Okay. Then I'll discard this. We won't talk more about that. Let me ask you a bit about Stretch Marks. Tell me about who they were, because they were a pretty popular band from Winnipeg, right?
Well, they were the top hardcore band out of Winnipeg. They were part of the Better Youth organization, so they were on the Something to Believe in sampler, I believe, if I recall. And they reached out to me. Somehow they got referred to me, and they wanted to know if I could promote their shows in Toronto. I said absolutely. And they came in. I made sure that they got a good show, and we promoted it well. And we got along extremely well. I mean, they were great guys. They always come out to see us when we showed up in Winnipeg. Good guys, wrestling punks, very odd.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, they had Headbutt Records was their first single.
And I remember they coined, they were so, enthralled with the way Sheen played. I mean, Sheen played a certain style, but they called it the sugar, 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 digga, digga, digga. I was like, they loved that for some reason. I was like, okay.
It's a catchy term. Sugar,
Yeah,
sugar,
sugar,
dugga, dugga.
Yeah,
Well,
sugar, digga, digga, digga.
it definitely had like a riding, crunching sound, right?
Yeah.
It's almost, I mean, you could think there's lots of ways to look at it, but I wanted to get into like you were mentioning the BYO connection. So, can you tell me a bit about the BYO connection?
Sure.
Did you become allied with like BYO? Were you sort of like a BYO Toronto?
Yeah, I'm not aligned with the Better Youth Organization as an organization, but through the stretch marks, I proved my worth as a promoter, and that's what I wanted to do. And then I got a call from, I can't remember which one of the brothers, whether it was Sean or whomever.
They one of the Stern brothers?
Stern brothers, and they wanted to, I can't remember who was next, whether it was the Unwanted or I did a bunch of 7 seconds, whoever it was. I mean, so they started based on what stretch marks had
Funneling
funneled
bands
back to
towards,
them.
yeah.
They started funneling bands to me because I was doing right by them.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of the BYO connection. I became the de facto promoter for the BYO, the stable of bands.
So can you remind us a bit about, like, because I remember seeing some things in MRR at the time about sort of the BYO principles. I think one of them might have been like an all ages show, getting well paid. Like, was there some things like that? Like there were sort of some things that people were trying to strive for with the BYO show, right?
Yeah. They wanted to make sure that the bands were paid fairly. There was a heavy emphasis on all ages shows, not so much for the stretch marks or Unwanted or anything like that, but certainly for 7 Seconds and for the Youth Brigade, well, the Brigade at the time. Yeah, they really insisted on all-age shows,
Yeah.
which is incredibly hard for a promoter.
At that time, too, I
Yeah.
imagine, because most of the places were bars at that time, right?
Yeah, that means you have to rent a hall.
Yeah.
You have to rent a sound system, a sound engineer. There's all these incremental costs to it. You have to rent vehicles to move the equipment there. And then, of course, try and get a healthy paycheck for the bands.
Right. So that was like a big ask, really.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned the Something to Believe in compilation. I remember that being sort of an instrumental compilation at the time. Can you tell me a bit about the importance of that compilation? Yeah. Sorry, I'll leave it to you.
I mean, it was one of the best compilations that were out there. It was one of those ones that everybody had to have, sort of like the Boston Not LA, those kind of things. So I think through that, there was a lot of Canadian bands on it because, of course, the Stearns were Canadians, and you got exposed to, like I said, Zero Option, which was an old recording. I think No Policy was on there from Montreal.
Yeah.
Fantastic band.
Yeah.
Rebecca was a great guitarist. Obviously, Stretch Marks.
Youth were on there. Young
Youth.
Lions.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was one of those must-have albums as far as I'm concerned. I think it showcased Canada to the Americans.
You mentioned the Boston Not LA, and that Boston Not LA is like a pillar in terms of scene compilations. This was like an American Canadian sort of working together kind of thing, project at a time when it was difficult for bands to cross borders, and so in some ways I find that there's more importance in this compilation because it was like a project where we were working together and crossing a border, even if it wasn't like, it was a way to cross the border. It was like there was like a significance to that, right?
Yeah, there was another effort that was underway that never actually saw the light of day, where Ken Lester, the manager for DOA, he wanted to do an album of all the top hardcore bands across Canada. So he wanted to get the top ones in each city across Canada, do this big compilation. DOA, the Subhumans, Dayglo's, S.N.F.U, Hype. I don't know who was in, I guess, Scum in Montreal. I don't know who was in, active in Ottawa at the time. But find all of those key Canadian bands and then put them on Neighborhood Watch from out
Fredericton.
east.
Yeah.
Put them on one showcase album, and he wanted to put a film behind it as well, so like a touring thing. And it was a grand idea. And we talked about it when I was in Vancouver, and we were at this event with him, and just never saw the light of day. But we were totally in, but didn't happen.
It's too bad.
Yeah, it is too bad.
I think of that compilation that Psych Industries put out called Came From the Pit, which had Problem Children, and some of those bands, Scum, I think, was on it. And I think maybe someone did try and give life to that idea somehow.
It's a great way to showcase bands. I mean, we had a phenomenal, stable of bands in Toronto, and they could have gone anywhere, and they would have been, and a lot of them did, and go to other cities, and they're welcomed as, oh my God, look, like, this is fantastic. Look at Sons of Ishmael are here, or Problem Children, or whoever. Sudden Impact, Direct Action. we had really top quality bands, and they were well received in other cities.
Do you remember the band The Police? The Police?
Yeah, the Police.
Do you know Miles Copeland? He was the manager.
I don't know personally, but yeah.
No, but you know who I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
Stuart Copeland's brother, and he managed the Police, and he ran IRS Records. He put out a movie called ARG, A Music War, which was about the new wave scene, and it had like Steel Pulse and like Gang of Four, Echo and the Bunnymen, sort of that genre of bands. But that movie, which it hasn't been digitized and is often sought after now these days, but it was an amazing showcase of what was happening in England at the time, and it's the same idea. I think of it as the same principle. I think this would have been the same idea. It would have totally catapulted everything to a different level.
Yeah.
And even just in terms of documentation. Let me ask you, now we're talking about documentation, I wanted to ask you about the first Hype album,
Sure.
Which is called Life is Hard, Then You Die. Do you know when this was recorded?
So it would have been recorded in 1984, and it was and pressed and produced in 84.
It comes out on Reuben Kincade
Yep.
Productions. So this becomes a label project.
No, it became a label.
It sort of became a label. You became you went from manager to label. Can you tell me a bit about I want to ask you a bit about how this was recorded?
Sure.
Can you tell me, because it says Hedgehog Sounds, which was a bit of your logo. There's a sort of a Hype logo. Can you tell this? Can you describe this logo for us?
Sure. It's a hedgehog smacking his lips. That logo was literally stolen off a bag of potato chips that came from the UK called hedgehog flavored potato chips. And it's as stupid a story as that.
It's okay.
The Hype was a funny band. I mean, they loved humor, and so it was very bizarre stuff always going on. And so that's where we got that logo from. And the album, how do you go? I think we were the first band to actually do a full-length album in Toronto. So Youth had an EP out. We beat out Direct Action by about a month, I think.
Oh, was that close?
It was important to us.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
No, it's actually I didn't actually realize that you were the first band. So,
yep.
Was there a sense of competitiveness?
Sure, you wanted. I mean, Direct Action was awesome. I mean, you wanted to. If you weren't trying to be better and grow, then what's the point? There's some altruism to it and whatnot, and it's the punk ethos and whatnot. But if you were in a band, I think you're designed to get better and grow bigger and do bigger things. Not to do that is a waste of time, I think. And that's why I kept trying to, build Hype, move it into bigger and bigger things. And then for pressing a record, how the hell do you do that? I mean, what do we know about it? So I went up, found a pressing plant in Toronto, walked into their offices, met with them, and said, I want to make a record. How the heck do I do that? And so they explained the cost, how you do it, how the pressing works. And we went into our studio, which was something we built in Brian's basement, and recorded it live to track. And that's how we got the first album out.
The LP has a different sound than a lot of recordings that were coming out of Toronto at that time. So I wondered where it was done. So it was a self-made studio.
Self-made, and it was actually quite the effort because it was all sort of soundproofed.
I heard the soundproofing. Can you tell me the soundproofing?
Sure.
Story?
So we actually built a studio and then a I don't know what you call it, like a booth. So we had a window put in. Brian's dad was very, very helpful with money and whatnot. So we actually built a recording studio where we had the glass wall, the window. The entire studio was soundproof with this sort of soundproof matting, and on top of that, egg cartons.
Right.
Thousands and thousands of egg cartons because Jerry used to work at a supermarket. So all of the egg carton things that were discarded, we just took them, and the whole thing was egg cartons. It looked like some sort of NASA bubble, and it actually worked.
Yeah, wow. That's amazing. It's a real DIY project.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. I don't know if you know Asexuals. They were a band from Sweden. Their father also helped them build the studio in their place. It was in the center of Sweden, so lots of bands from Sweden would come to the center. It was easy for them to travel to Sweden.
Yep.
And because of that, a lot of the Swedish scene got documented that way. Did other bands record in this studio space, or just
no? The only other person that would come down was Jeff Healy. So every once in a while, he would come down and he would just fool around in the studio. And I remember Brian's parents used to get so angry because I don't think they understood that, he was without sight. And he would be banging the walls because he insisted on carrying his stuff down the stairs, and he would sort of bang into the walls a little bit,
Yeah.
yelling, "Stop banging the walls!" It's like he's blind. Leave him alone.
So there's something that I think is incredible about an LP. First off, when did hype start? In 1984?
No, in
Earlier?
1982.
82.
Yeah.
When did they really get going?
Really, I think 84. So, I mean, the first show started in 83. But I think 84 things really started picking up.
This record is dated April 85. But it has a copyright of 84. So that says April 85 for the sound.
Produced.
But so I don't know, like, yeah, I'm trying to figure out, but
yeah, I was talking to my brother, the bassist, last night, and we're almost certain this was in 84.
It says 84 here.
I don't know if that's a typo or
could be. So, but as a first release, usually bands go to like doing a demo. Certainly, Toronto has
the tapes.
Was all tapes mostly, right? Which in some ways makes it easy to be the first album because most of everything came out as cassettes before that. Then people they would jump into a 7-inch if they were around long enough, and then an LP. But hype jumped straight into an LP. Yeah. What was the? It seems like you kind of. Do you feel like you skipped a few steps, or was it? What was the reasoning behind going straight to an LP?
I don't know,
because it's a ballsy jump. I think that's what I think.
I don't know that there was a lot of thought behind it, to be honest with you. I mean, people were putting out cassettes, but they were kind of cheap, and we didn't want to go that route.
Was it because vinyl is like almost like a legitimized release?
Yeah, it's like you exist, you're real, you're not just taping stuff. And the Youth, the EP was balls to the wall. I mean, I love that thing.
Yeah,
and that was like, man, we want one of these. And it was, other bands were producing obviously records, and we were buying them, and we wanted to go that route.
So that Sin 12 inches is definitely an inspiration. Okay, so let me ask you about the title, Life is Hard and Then You Die. Where does that come from? Because I think of it as like, well, tell me about it.
It was a saying that came from Chris. Chris always came up with these sayings, and it's just sort of, I don't know.
So I took philosophy in university, and this is one of the, like, I think that I'm trying to think of which philosopher it was. I think it was Hobbes. I think it was Hobbes. Like, the life is brutish and short. Like, life is hard, brutish and short. So I think of it as coming from that same ethos, right?
Yeah.
And that was certainly the punk side. So life is a terrible existence, and you try and make it better. And then there was the Rousseau version where life is great, and sometimes you get perverted and things go south, right? So they took like a view at life philosophies, and this was sort of the Hobbesian view. And I'm thinking of, like, Hobbesian views were, to me, more of the punk philosophy in some ways, right?
Yeah, that really
in some ways I think of you guys as philosophers.
Yeah.
Accidental.
It's interesting because Chris was the one that came up with that, and a few other sayings that sort of stuck with the band. Everybody brought something different to the band. Chris was definitely the philosopher. You could spend at a party all night long talking to Chris about philosophy, about social justice, and where other guys in the band that wasn't their thing. They were more about music or fun or jokes or humor. Everybody had a different take on it. Chris was definitely the deep philosopher.
This is the drummer?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And he was kind of not disillusioned, but it was like, we're not making a difference in the end. It was like, this isn't living up to what I thought. And it was really deeply rooted in him.
Oh, okay.
Like, you could sit down with this guy for hours, and he would go on and on about...
He was the real social conscience of the band?
Yeah.
Would you say? Okay. Let me ask you about the cover shot, the photo. Yeah. Can you describe the cover photo for me?
So the cover is actually, it was taken in Toronto, and it's a picture of a homeless guy that's asleep on the street. And honestly, we were looking for something provocative, something shocking. So we went into Toronto looking to do a photo. I think it was Monica who actually took the photo. I don't know if it was Joe or Monica, but I thought it was Monica. And we saw this guy, and clearly he was...
Can you tell me who Monica is first?
Monica was Brian's girlfriend,
okay.
And she was sort of the de facto photographer for the band.
Okay. Yeah. Well, she would be at the shows and want to take a part,
lots of photos,
play part in everything, right? Sure.
We saw this guy, and he was stumbling around, and clearly he was moments away from collapsing. So we literally just waited for him to collapse somewhere, And as soon as he went down, we slapped a couple of posters up behind him.
I was going to say, what were the chances of a hype poster being behind it?
Yeah, pretty slim.
Right.
And so we just pulled out a couple of hype posters, put them up on the wall, and there you go.
It works well with the cover,
Yeah.
for sure. Okay, so let me ask you a bit about being a manager for a band. I think of a lot of punk bands as not having managers, and I think that may have been like, did Hype ever suffer anything from having a manager, as it being something too fitting into a rock cliche? Do you know what I mean? Because I view you as different than a rock band manager, so I want to try and capture the difference of it. But I also wonder if there was like some maybe envy or jealousy or. And then I think of that maybe this led to other things, like because it felt like you took a lot of other bands under your wing, and I think you really tried to build a scene. I think you were different from a manager in that as a promoter you tried to give a lot of opportunities to people and pay them well. So that we've already sort of covered that territory. And I think of traditional rock managers as just being in it for themselves. They always take the cut off the top, like you know, all that stuff. So I don't think of you that way, but I also like wonder. That would have maybe been looked down upon had somebody not known who you were or like had any history with you. And so if somebody says, "Oh, they had a manager," who the hell do they think they are, kind of thing, right? Do you think there was like some animosity that created by that idea until they met you? I think. Yeah,
maybe. I don't know if there was animosity between any.
Did you ever get a weird vibe from anybody coming through town? That's what I'm asking.
No, not from any of the bands or anything like that, but. I have to imagine there must have been people in the scene that thought, you know, who the hell do they think they are? They got a manager, you know, they got this promoter. He puts hype on the show sometimes, because I didn't put him on all the time, and that was an area of friction between me and the band, because sometimes I would say, sorry, no, you're not playing, and that was me, the promoter, versus
Yeah, but you're trying to give everyone a chance, right?
I'm trying to give everybody a chance, but honestly, I was trying to throttle how often they played, because, and especially
people get sick of seeing them too, right?
Yeah, because you had to pull back. And I say this in all seriousness, certain bands, like I said, Sudden Impact, Problem Children, and a few others, they legitimately should be a headlining band, and I believe Hype should be a headlining band, and was. And they were hugely welcomed in other cities as a headlining band. I mean, it was a big deal when Hype came to some of these cities. So you can't play every weekend. You need to really throttle back and make it special when you do play. So S.N.F.U. doesn't play every weekend in Edmonton. They just don't.
Yeah.
They
might be a local band, but yeah.
So you need to sort of stake your claim, pull back a bit, and give the local acts time to bring up, get their chops, and do their thing.
I've heard that comment as we've been working on the book. I've heard that comment from people. If we've talked about some of the shows that you've put on, it's almost a joke where they go, "Well, Hype must have been on that show," because you know what I mean. There's that feeling of like. Well, of course, you put them on the bill because they're your band, right? Yep. Did you feel like it maybe held Hype back in other ways, like maybe with Jill's shows, because Hype had been on so many of your bills that it maybe prevented them from getting on other bills with other promoters?
It probably did, because Jill and I would talk about it, and then there was no, Jill didn't book Hype. She didn't need to, and that was an understanding between Jill and I. So, it just sort of worked itself out.
But they probably didn't get to play some of the bands with like some of the older bands that may have given them a. I think
there was some,
she was like you were saying, she was bringing like Black Flag to town, and like that would have been a huge difference if Hype had played a Black Flag show. Well, I mean, somewhat.
It depends on the band.
You would have seen they would have been a different crowd certainly coming out, and certainly Greg Ginn going back to LA going, hey, have you heard of Hype?
Yeah,
like,
This is kind
you know what I mean?
This is kind of an idea too that I've had that thought over the years of how did it work out. Like, how did you get certain bands? Jill got certain bands. How did those connections? How did you build those connections? You mentioned about BYO being a one of the stepping stones, but there's a bunch of other bands like Rhythm Pigs, for instance, that you booked and you got a relationship with. I've wondered about that. How did she get a line on certain bands and you got a line on different bands? How did you guys develop that, and how did you not step on each other's toes?
Yeah, it really happened just organically, because Jill was around before I was, and she had a real tight linkage to the more established bands, that predated us, so the Black Flags. I mean, I know she was extremely close with Henry Rollins. She knew all the Circle Jerks, all the sort of the bigger bands from the older period, whereas a lot of the newer bands, they didn't have any connection to they didn't know who Jill was. So they would read in Maximum Rock and Roll scene reviews, or they would talk to other bands going, who do I talk to about getting a show in Toronto? And then my name would get floated out, or Jill's name would get sorted out. And sometimes Jill would phone me and go, look, I got this band. I really can't do it. I'm too busy. Okay, I'll pick it up. And that's kind of the way it worked. Sometimes I had people coming up to me, even guys in Hype always assumed there must be this animosity between you and Jill because you're competing, and we never were. I loved Jill. I thought she was fantastic. She taught me so much about how to get bands across the border. It just works, and just worked.
Yeah, we've even seen some flyers where there's joint co-productions.
Yeah, I don't remember that, but it's certainly. I see it. I created the flyer. So
there's a show I'm going to ask you about later on in the interview
Sure.
where you're both on it. I just don't. I can't find it right now at the moment. I wanted to ask you. I wanted to go back a little bit to ask you about Negative Gain. Was Negative Gain also a band that you sort of helped?
Yeah,
You took under your wing? Because Grant told me about stories. Told me a story about meeting some. Yeah, was it Harvey's?
Yeah.
It was somewhere. I thought it was a Tim Hortons, but it was a Harvey's. He said you would meet there regularly, like almost weekly, and go over things that were coming up over the week. Is that sort of how you kind of helped organize these guys?
Yeah. So Negative Gain were kind of our younger brothers. At first, we didn't know each other very well, and then we get to know each other. We partied a lot together. And then, I wanted to get them on as many shows as I could. They didn't play near as often because they just couldn't. Younger kids, they had other issues, school and whatnot. And I tried to help out Negative Gain as much as I could. Along the way, they did ask me to help manage them. I reluctantly agreed, only because I knew I wasn't going to have a lot of time to do it. So I did a few shows for them and tried to help them wherever I could, but then I think Jill really helped them out with connection to Pussmort, and then getting their album off the table, which was fantastic. So they were under my wing, but they knew that Hype was my first priority. But I always had a soft spot for Negative Gain, obviously, because they were us. They were one of our guys.
So, in sort of as a follow-up question to this, a little bit, we talk about. I'm looking at Oakville and I'm thinking two of the biggest promoters at the time in Toronto come out of Oakville.
What are the odds?
And two of the biggest bands, Negative Gain and Hype, come out of Toronto. And it makes you ask the question, what was in the water? What do you think? What do you think it was about Oakville and its relationship to Toronto, being a smaller scene, maybe trying to prove your worth? Maybe I don't know what it is really, but what do you think it is about this about Oakville that had so many power players in the early Toronto hardcore scene? Do you think there was something there?
I don't honestly think there's anything there.
Wanting to belong is to a scene. Is it? I don't know what it is. I'm trying to think.
No.
Because sometimes, I think
sounds
people
boring,
go the extra.
But I really don't think there was anything special about Oakville per se. Because if you look at, I don't know where Young Lions and Youth and United States, the older cadre. I don't know where they were based, but after they went and then Direct Action faded and they died, the hardcore scene in Toronto, I think, then suddenly exploded and flourished, and almost without exception, all of the bands were coming from suburbs, whether it was Meaford or I'm trying to think of all the other places they were coming from. Burlington, Oakville,
Scarborough,
Mississauga, Don Mills.
Yeah, where was Sudden Impact from? Richmond,
Aurora,
Newmarket.
All of the bands were from somewhere else. We were Toronto bands. Hype considered itself a Toronto band through and through, and it really annoyed us when people would say we're an Oakville band. Honestly, that was.
Well, we didn't ever think of you as an Oakville band.
Yeah, we were a Toronto band. In fact, all of the bands that I could think of, maybe Decimation was more Toronto based, but by and large, most of them came from somewhere else. They were part of an extended scene.
Well, and even the Direct Action guys, St. Catharines, originally, right?
Oh, really?
When they were the unknowns.
The unknowns, yeah. Let me. I want to go back to Negative Gain for a second. You did a column in Pirates of Doom fanzine called Reuben's Ramblings. Do you remember?
Ramblings, yeah.
Yeah.
That was Barbasand pushing me.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So, and he later joins Hype, and in it. In your first column, you berate Pete Warner for taking his life. Yeah. And at the time, I viewed it maybe as a lesson in something not to do, because you were saying lots of people were sort of idolizing him. There was sort of this and you felt that was the wrong direction to be taking with this. And I viewed it more as like, in hindsight, I'm viewing it more as like grieving, right? You're sort of sad that he did this and disappointed that he did it.
He was,
but I want to give you a second chance to say something nice about the guy, because the column comes off, and even Barbizon in the column says, Don's not always an asshole.
Well, and just as a setup too, people might not know who Pete is.
So maybe you could tell me who Pete Warner was. So that's what I want to give you a second chance to say something nice about Pete Warner. So maybe you could start off by giving context to him.
Sure. I didn't know Pete very well, so he was the lead singer for Negative Gain at the sort of at the beginning. He was a great guy, but he had troubles. He ended up taking his life. And he wasn't the only one. There were a number of people, for whatever reason, within our network, and not punks per se, but people that we knew in the extended relationships within the hype band. There were 2 or 3 others that took their lives. And it was just like this wave of people that just sort of gave up and maybe took the easy way out. I don't know, but they had serious issues. They didn't get help. I don't know what the answers are, but it seemed to me like people were putting Pete on this pedestal for doing what he did, and I didn't think that was. I love the guy. As much as I knew him, but and he was a great singer, and he was. But he shouldn't have died. That's the end of the story on that. I don't think that was a good thing. We lost some good friends because they did silly things or made decisions or couldn't handle it.
Yeah.
I don't know how to get into that deeper, but...
Actually, I remember when Pete died, people were almost romanticizing his death. And I remember when that column came out, you and I had a conversation about it, and you actually... It's not that you were putting him down.
No.
You weren't putting anybody down. You were pretty much putting down the people that were romanticizing him. And, instead of mourning the loss of your friend, you were putting him up on this pedestal as almost as something to aspire to, without actually recognizing that this guy actually had some problems.
Yeah. There was people would spend more time talking about what he was buried with than the guy had issues. And he didn't get any help, or it just didn't work out. That was the bigger thing. People would talk about what T-shirt he was wearing, what he was buried with. It's like sort of this whole a punk all the way to the end. Yeah, okay, but the kid was young. He lost his life, for God's sakes. That's not a good result.
Yeah, for sure.
Maybe it was because I was older than everybody else. The rest of the guys. Sheen was sort of my age, but I was definitely older than anybody in that whole group. So I had maybe a different take on it.
Yeah, no, for sure. No, and I think it was I'm not singling you out for because that was actually.
If I wrote it, I own it.
No, but I also feel like you represented a lot of opinions at the time, because I felt the same way. I felt like, oh, what a loss! Like this is not.
I wasn't shy about certain things.
But let me ask you. I want to take a different tact about Negative Gain, because I don't want this to be the only stuff that we talk about with Negative Gain. I want you to, if you could now, take a minute to describe them to us, like in terms of a sound, and like you've already talked about them being younger and things like that. But I want you to paint us a picture of like the importance of Negative Gain, because to me, they brought the skate fast, like they were faster than any bands that in the Toronto scene. There was like the stop and start thing that they did that like we hadn't seen since Chronic Submission. And so like there's a lot of things that I feel, and then they get a record out on a label in San Francisco. So there's a lot of things that are, there's a whole bunch, that is a perfect fit for the label because of the, Passhead was like into the grindier, faster stuff and also into skating. So can you describe, I don't want to say any more because I've already talked a bit about it, but can you tell us about Negative Gain? Describe them to us, because I just want to put some context to them.
You mean as a band, their sound?
Yes.
And,
yeah,
definitely. What
were they trying to do?
They were the first skate band that we knew of. Wickedly fast, that whole JFA, that whole skate punk, super fast thrash. And most of the experience I have is with Grant as the singer. And if you recall, Grant's vocal styles was basically like full-on assault of screaming. And it was fast, and it was amazing. And I remember they had that signature song, "My Old Man's an Asshole."
Yes,
and that was
which is
if there was one song that was a skank, perfect for skanking around or circle thrashing, whatever you want to call it. That was it, because it would the whole place would just erupt in circle thrashing.
Yeah.
What was the with Grant? Somebody alluded to this, but I don't remember what his move was. But when he became just the singer, when he wasn't playing guitar, apparently he had a move that related to his football background. Do you remember that? And
I think he played football, but I also seem to remember him. He was a wrestler, and I know he wanted to go into professional wrestling. And I thought, okay, well, it's kind of weird. It's kind of sort of like stretch marks.
I think he had some type of connection after, because he did go down to the States. He had a scholarship down to the States.
Yeah,
I believe,
North Carolina.
Yeah. But then after he came back, I think he went out to Calgary, and I think he
With the Hart brothers?
Yeah, I think he was a connection with Stampede Wrestling out there. And I seem to remember something about the Raging Canadians as being, he was part of a tag team out there.
I remember Grant talking about it, and I thought,
He was big enough to be a wrestler.
Oh, he absolutely
He was huge.
There was
I remember,
that guitar looked so small.
Yeah, exactly.
It was a mandolin.
He was like a mandolin.
and there were some shows where I knew that Negative Gain was going to be the absolute perfect band. I remember Target of Demand. They were very much like Negative Gain. I mean, full on, just assault your senses. And I remember Negative Gain and Target of Demand, when they played together, they got along so well, and they were just shooting shit back and forth. But it was, sometimes you just saw that right show, and sometimes I screwed it up. Sometimes I put on bands that clearly didn't link very well,
And that was at the DMZ, I think, the Target of Demand show.
Yeah, it was.
And so, it seemed like you booked a fair amount of stuff. Like, DMZ was only a short-lived club. It was only around for about 6 months, I think.
But can we talk about Larry's Hideaway first?
Sure.
Because I think you started doing shows at Larry's first, right?
Yep.
It sounds like you said the Turning Point.
Yep.
So maybe you could tell us about the Turning Point, because we wanted to capture some things, I guess some of the clubs and a bit of their personalities.
Oh, they all had personalities.
I think so. They did have living entity sort of things about them. So tell us about the Turning Point.
When I describe the Turning Point, you have to be of a certain age to understand the references. It looked like Arnold's from Happy Days that had been bombed out in a post-apocalyptic nightmare. I mean, who designed a hardcore club that had these round sort of...
well, it wasn't really a hardcore club, was it?
Well, these 50s style benches, and everything is spray painted black, everything's ripped, everything stinks, it's just decrepit. And it was a small club. It wasn't very big.
And it was like up a bunch of stairs, which wasn't easy to access.
You know, a funny thing that my brother and I were talking about, I said, one common thing, with the exception of one club in Regina, one thing that every hardcore club across this country, I can say, had in common was stairs. So every time you got somewhere, the band had to haul all their crap up a shitload of stairs. It was like we never caught a break. Except for Regina.
The DMZ, I guess, was a lucky break.
That one had a little stairs, but you had to come up No, that's right. That one wasn't too bad.
Yeah.
It was pretty much
they all seem to have stairs.
Yeah.
Narrow stairs.
Yeah, well, do you think, so if we're going to analyze this a little bit further, do you think it had something to do with them being old man bars and being sort of discarded bars, the bars that weren't really, that couldn't make it? Like they were basically desperate.
On their last legs.
They were desperate, and they would have taken anybody.
Yeah.
In some ways.
Well, the Turning Point was certainly that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me ask you about, I'm looking at this show here, which is from 1985, January 6th, Hype is headlining, it's at Larry's Hideaway, BFG is playing, and New Mr. Orr. Can you tell me about, maybe I'm going to ask you about BFG first. Can you tell me a bit about BFG? Because they are, you really can't talk about Toronto hardcore without talking about BFG.
Yeah. How do you describe them?
I've heard a few descriptions, I'm not going to give it away. Tell me I want your opinion on them.
I mean, Steve would get upset sometimes when I'd refer to them as, some part hardcore band, part gang. He didn't like the gang reference, and I said, "Well, you're kind of a gang."
No, there's no denying.
No getting around it. I mean,
no, for sure.
So
they were a gang of people.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a group of people, right? And they worked like a gang.
Yeah. I mean, we got along well with them enough that we could get by. I mean, sometimes they were adversarial with certain people, but we've certainly, we partied at the Fort Goof sometimes. Steve and I, sometimes I would hand over shows to Steve if I was out of town or whatnot. Sometimes they went well, sometimes not so much, but when they were running the DMZ, you needed to talk to the Goofs because they were sort of running the DMZ at the time.
Can I ask you about, so you were talking about handing over shows. Can I interject?
Sure.
There's often talk of an S.N.F.U. show that I think was initially you were booking and then had handed over to Steve Goof, and I think it was at the Bag
Yeah, it was
Dash
on
Temple.
Claremont, yeah.
Were you involved in it initially, and was that one of those handover shows? Do you recall?
It might have been.
Because I don't remember I remember people complaining that S.N.F.U didn't get to play.
Yeah, that show did not go well.
But it's often talked about, and I know that in the Chris Walter book on S.N.F.U, it comes up, but it doesn't they don't actually talk about who was organizing it.
Yeah.
Can you?
It might have been S.N.F.U because there was a show where I had agreed to book it, and it was a BYO act, so maybe it was S.N.F.U.
That would have been S.N.F.U.
And we were on tour, and so I said I can't actually functionally do it. So I handed off the reins to Steve and the Goofs to manage it. And then we were out west somewhere, and I was checking in. Back then you had to check in from payphones. And I remember getting an earful from one of the Stern brothers about this did not go well, blah,
Yeah.
blah, and
the temple was right across the street from a fire hall, and I remember hearing that the fire. I think the police had called the firemen to shut it down for whatever, I guess, fire regulations. They use fire code to shut it down, right?
it's a bad time to leave town.
Okay, so it was.
The show started very late. The show started a lot later than it should have, and I just remember, S.N.F.U just got on stage, and they had their lights on the stage, and everybody was having a great time, and all of a sudden there's lights everywhere. Yeah. All the lights are on in the hall, and we turn around, and there's cops and firemen there.
They only got to play maybe 2 or 3 songs, and the police basically turned off the power.
Yeah.
But the band, or to the PA anyway, but the band kept playing with, Chai Pig had no mic, but he was just screaming the words, and
everyone was singing along.
And I think that was the biggest pit I've ever seen in Toronto. Like everybody in the whole place just started running around in a big circle as a protest to the cops. The cops were watching it, and
not wanting to shut it down.
And the band and the audience just said, no, this isn't happening. And I think that was one of the first times I ever saw that, where the crowd, the band, everybody was standing up against the police and saying, no, it's not ending like this.
And I think I heard that Steve was trying to get equipment there, because there wasn't a PA set up, and there was, like you talked about the all ages venues, there was a lot more to set up, and he was trying to scrounge stuff together to make it happen. So I think there was a lot of people working sort of last minute to get this going.
Yeah, it was not a finest hour.
Okay. But tell me a bit more about BFG, because they also, we talked a bit about them being sort of part punk, part gang. What do you think about them in terms of a sound and in terms of an impact on the scene? Let me ask you about the sound first, because those are 2 big questions.
I personally find them kind of generic hardcore, just to be bluntly honest.
I heard Buzz describe them as, at the time, there was hardcore bands were trying to sound really heavier and almost more professional, and then the Goofs come along and strip everything away.
Yeah, they try and be
they,
as least.
They brought it back
possible.
to primal punk, right?
Yeah.
It was almost they bring it back to a minimalism.
Yeah, like a off-key crass.
They're kind of almost seeing them. It was kind of almost like the show was almost more important than the music. It was my impression, because I agree with you. Musically, I thought that they had a few standout songs, but they were fairly generic in terms of that. But visually, I think that they were pretty interesting, smashing TVs and having a guy with a huge mohawk on stage playing, that looked like a giant.
Yeah.
And it was real. I mean, these guys were living the life. So the show was everything. The music as it was recorded was okay. There were a few good songs, but
also as an impact on the scene, they also become somewhat like scene builders, because they have one of the first punk run clubs, right?
Yep.
First punk run hardcore clubs, I guess.
How did that even come together, though? That's another thing I've wondered. Is that I heard it was the Paramount, right? Was the name of it, and then it closed. Yeah, I've always wondered, how did the Goofs end up taking that over?
I thought they had some in with the Quoc-Tay, because it was right in Kensington Market. I don't know if that's true or not, but I don't know how they got into.
It's right across from the fort, so
yeah, I don't know how they got in on creating the DMZ. It just did, and it was this new club. Okay, fairly large.
Well, that's a question for Steve. I guess we'll have to wait for him. But then, how did you get involved with booking things with them?
Well, it was a club, so you go where the action is. So. There's an open club. Okay, so I started booking, and maybe that was in a hiatus between Larry's and whatever, I can't remember the order, El Dico, Starwood, Bridge, whatever the hell it
Yeah.
was called at the time.
So I think it's Larry's first, right? So let me
Larry's
ask,
was definitely before the Bridge, El Dico's thing.
let me talk about Larry's first, because that becomes the next that becomes the place that we're talking about, sort of. And I wanted to ask you about, can you describe Larry's to us?
It was a great club, actually. It had fantastic acoustics.
That's what No Mind said too.
Yeah, it really. I mean, it was dirty. It was scummy. If you ever ended up in the back area that some of the bands can get access to, or in any of those hotel rooms, oh my God, it was really brutal. But it was a really great place to play for a band.
It looked like it was. So was it a hotel before?
Yeah, it was some sort of hotel, and that was sort of some sort of bar in the ground floor.
So that's where we played in the ground floor, the basement.
And it had all these nooks and crannies, because it had the main floor, but it had all these nooks and crannies that people were standing behind barriers and they could see through something. You could fit a lot of people, but they were all tucked away in corners.
There was pillars too in the middle of the pit.
Yeah, pillars all over the place, and I remember.
They became so you had to run around them a bit.
Yeah, the back door was frequently used to get people in because they always had security on the front door. And we, early on, I think it was actually Direct Action, maybe it was Dave that actually told us, or one of the other guys, Tim or whoever from Direct Action, they actually schooled us on how the scam at Larry's actually works. So they have their free tickets, Hardcore Sundays. And so the guy that ran Larry's would give you whatever, like 1,000 free tickets, and you put them at the Record Peddler and all these stores, and people
you would see them everywhere. Yeah,
you'd bring in your free ticket and you get access. And the show would get paid $1 for every ticket that was brought in. And so at the end of the show, he would be sequestered in this room, door locked, and he would come out and go, "This is how many people were here. This is how many tickets were given." Quickly, like, well, it doesn't seem to jive with what I'm seeing on the floor. And the guys from Direct Action, that's bullshit. They're throwing stuff in the garbage. So here's what you do: you always take some of your free tickets, keep them, drop them in the box when they're not looking, and then so you pad it up so that you're actually going to get the bands paid what they're supposed to.
I remember you reading something about a scene report in Pirates of Doom where you mentioned about how they were crooks, about how people at Larry's Hideaway were crooks, the people who paid you were crooks. So that's part of what you're talking about, right?
So and I remember one time, this is the most surreal thing, was Larry's Hideaway, for whatever reason, invited Direct Action and Hype to
tell me about
a Christmas
this
party.
So was this not an awards party?
Yeah, it was some sort of awards Christmas party. And so we're there.
Did you win an award for something?
I don't think so.
Okay. So
we heard otherwise.
Did we?
Yeah.
That you specifically won an award.
If I did, I don't remember.
Okay.
So it was a big moment in your career then.
Oh yeah, it was a highlight.
So Hype and Direct Action are at a Christmas party that are thrown by Larry's Hideaway. Yeah. But tell me about the crowd that was there with you.
You know, imagine every dirty long hair rocker band imaginable, and then there's us in Direct Action.
Did you think you were going to get out of there alive?
It was odd. We kind of stuck together, and kind of like, well, you know, when do we get the heck out of here? And they had, if I recall, they had some sort of buffet, and you kind of go, I'm not touching that food.
Yeah.
There's no way.
For sure.
I've seen better strip clubs. But it was as a club goes, from a band perspective, the guys always loved playing there because it had the phenomenal acoustics, better than any other club that we ever played at in Toronto. And
Now, your sound. The one thing that always, that's something that always set Hype apart as well. Not only did you have a manager, but you had your own sound guy, and you had Neil McDonald who produced the album, but he also worked at Larry's, or he ended up. Yeah. So he ended up working there after you guys, or was he a friend of yours prior?
He ended up working there after. So he was one of our friends. Again, a guy that failed at finding a job within the band. Yeah. He was originally a drummer. He had bought a set of drums, but he didn't pan out as a drummer. So the drums actually went to Chris, who was capable of drumming, but didn't own a set of drums. They were Neil's drums. So Neil was like, okay, well, I'll be a sound guy. Everybody that couldn't do something creative took another job. Okay. And so Neil became a sound guy. And
he became one of the best in the city.
Yeah, he was actually quite good. He ended up, we ended up owning that the soundboard out of Larry's Hideaway, and then he went on. Went on to be a professional.
You owned it,
We owned it. We bought it. We owned it.
And so they used it at Larry's, and then you took it with you, or something?
No, we bought it. We took it when Larry's was going under, and we took this.
Okay.
I can't remember, 24-channel mixing board. It was phenomenal. It was huge. I ended up selling it years later. But that was that became our soundboard, and Neil went on to become a professional sound man. I know he was on the road with who's that industrial band that was out of Vancouver?
Skinny Puppy.
Skinny
Yeah.
Puppy. He was a sound man for Skinny Puppy, and then he was constantly on shows with old rock bands. And I remember I'd meet him years later, and it's like he was always like this sort of, I don't know, goofy ex-hockey goalie. And then when you meet him, he's like, this guy's been in the music business a long time. He's like, he's got swag. He's got a swagger to him. He's like, "Ooh, okay."
When you talk about the soundboard, though, like, I mean, people didn't go in with soundboards and set them up in
No,
clubs.
not at Larry's.
Would this be like something that you used as a studio, like a new
Yeah.
board for the studio,
Yep.
and practicing and things like that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or if we were doing a hall show, we had between the soundboard, all the mic stands, and my brother Jerry had these 2 massive speakers that were actually PA speakers that he used for his bass. So we had a fully functioning sound system anytime we needed to set up a whole PA system.
Okay. I want to talk to you about a show that you did on February 2nd in 1985 at Larry's that looks like one of the...
It's a lot of bands.
Yeah, there's a ton of bands on here, and it looks like, basically the Toronto hardcore scene with a Boston band. So it's Hype, Dead End, The Knot, who are from Boston. I remember them being sort of like a mod-inspired band from Boston. Sudden Impact, BFG, and Angry Thalidomide Babies. So there's quite a few bands there I want to ask you about, but I want to start off with Dead End if I could. Or maybe I'll ask you about The Knot from Boston, because we start to see you bringing a lot of bands from Boston in, and I wonder if The Knot had something to do with that.
I don't know who came first, the Freeze or the Knot.
The Knot.
Okay.
The Freeze are next or later.
I think they literally found me out of the blue, maybe out of the Maximum Rock.
Was there a connection to the Freeze or to other bands from Boston? No,
not that I'm aware of. I mean, they clearly knew who they were, but they just contacted me. We wanted to tour through Toronto. I said okay, and they weren't very big, so they were kind of slotted a little bit further down the.
Okay, well, let me ask you about Dead End, because they're second on the billing. They seem to be a pretty important player in Toronto's hardcore scene. Maybe an earlier wave. I don't know. Can you tell me a bit about them?
I don't honestly. I don't remember a lot about them.
Okay. Sudden Impact. So we've mentioned Sudden Impact a little bit.
Yep.
Maybe we'll talk about them later. I want to ask you about Angry Thalidomide Babies, because this is one of the only times I see them on your flyers, and then I start seeing them as a different band. So can you tell me a bit about them?
Who did they end up becoming?
Sons of Ishmael.
Sons of Ishmael.
And actually, I think they changed their name that night. I think that was...
did they?
This would be the last time you'd see it.
It was on the flyer, but then when they showed up, I think that was the first time they actually used the new name.
The singer is the reason why I wanted to always talk to you to do an interview with you, but he impressed upon me on the importance of doing an interview with you.
Oh,
Tim
okay.
Freeborn. So...
Oh, Tim, yes.
Yeah, so we struck some memory.
Okay.
Can you tell me a bit about them? Because they seem to be a bit of they're from Meaford, small town, Oakville, kind of smallish town. I'm thinking there might be a kindred spirit there, like feeling like, I'm just wondering if
Not
there
per
was
se
something.
between the bands. I mean, everybody got along, but this is probably, Angry Thalidomide Babies was probably one of many bands where they were at a Toronto show and they saw me and they came over. And it was always funny, they come over and go, hi, we're from so-and-so, we've got this band, and, is there any chance maybe we could play in the future? I'm like, yeah, sure. And I had this little black book that I kept all these names in, and I would take their number, and then, maybe a month or two later, you got a show, and I'm like going through, and I go, I don't want to keep playing the same bands over and over again. So I give them a call, and they'd be shocked, like, oh my God, someone's actually going to give us a show. And I'm like, yeah, why not?
Yeah.
Why wouldn't I?
Yeah, for sure.
So, and then I guess, and Sons of Ishmael were big, faves of ours. So I don't know what to say other than gave them a shot, and it went from there.
Okay. Okay. Let's talk about the DMZ then, because that's the next place that we start seeing shows at, and this is 1985, I believe. So I think these are the shows that start happening in '85. That DMZ starts taking over as the place where hardcore happens. AOD.
AOD, love those.
Who
guys.
are they?
Adrenalin OD.
Yes. Who are they?
Who are they?
Tell me about them.
Fast thrash, wicked sense of humor, just very quirky songs.
Did they have an influence on Hype?
I don't think directly. I mean, Hype listened to a lot of different. Everybody listened to different stuff, whether it was British or American hardcore, or there was some reggae involved and whatnot. But Adrenalin OD was one of the bands that, if I told Hype that Adrenalin OD was coming, they'd be like, "Oh wow!" For us, they were like a big band. The Freeze was a big band.
Sure.
Adrenalin OD, you had the records.
So this would have been like maybe the first big band that Hype plays with.
Maybe.
I mean, there was the Youth Brigade show, but that was a different Hype. So
yeah.
I think this might become like the first one.
It might have been, but I remember Adrenalin OD ended up staying at our place, and we got along very well. I'm not going to go into some of those stories, but there was a kindred spirit between the bands on many things.
Okay. You don't think there's something worth telling? Because I think that
AOD... We introduced them to hot kniving. They've never seen that before, ever, and we kind of thought,
it seems
you're
like
AOD, you should know everything.
It seems like a common thing growing up as a punk kid for me that people know about hot knives, and they didn't know. That hadn't been a practice in New Jersey?
I guess not.
I've heard that from other people, actually.
And
they've learned that in, they've learned that
from you guys.
Exactly.
Really pigs learn hot knives from you guys.
Oh, did they?
Seems like a Toronto thing.
We had a lot of good times.
Canadian thing, hot knives there. Who knew?
Yeah. And AOD was and maybe it was one of the first bands where we would have bands come in and they would stay at what we call the Hype House, our place. And sometimes bands would say, "No, I don't need anywhere to stay." In the last minute, they say, "You know what? Actually, we could use a place to crash. Okay, you can stay at the Hype House." And so we bring them back. And sometimes they'd stay over a day or something and go, "Is there anything going on? Are there any parties or something?" And there really wasn't anything planned. And we had a joke that, and it was reality, I could make one phone call to Negative Gain. And I go, "Guys, I got, AOD here, party, our place tomorrow night. Tell everybody." And I only have to phone one person, like Steve Curry, the bassist from Negative Gain. And I guarantee you that party was rocking.
The punk phone tree.
Oh, it was packed. Everybody was there. And the bands that we brought in, whether it was Countdown Zero, No Pause, they were in seventh heaven because we had a great party going on.
Yeah.
How did that go over with the neighbors in
Not good.
Oakville?
Not good. Which leads us back to the evictions. But
so how many Hype houses were there?
3.
So tell me about where they were. Tell me about the first one. Is this would have been maybe when the first one was around?
It might have
1985. I was thinking that's early.
Yeah. So the first one was an apartment on the ground floor, which was a stupid decision. It was in an apartment building, and it was a really big apartment. There was always about 7 of us living together. I mean, even at one point, we had a guy living in our closet, if you can believe it. I mean, there was just so many people living there in Oakville.
It's not the strangest thing I've heard.
Okay. And we were on the ground floor, and we happened to have this big, huge multi-bedroom apartment next to the superintendent of the building. Bad mistake.
Sure. Yeah.
And so we had a big, huge party there, and somebody brought some cowboys to the party. Like, honestly, and just, the Vandals will tell you what happens when punks and cowboys get together. A fight broke out. Somebody was taking a swing at Neil. Next thing you know, a huge fight breaks out. We actually got the guys outside, and they turn around and they picked this huge rock up a brick, and they threw it through our window. And anyways, we were evicted after that. And then the second Hype House was the one that burned up on near Upper Middle, like you were talking about. That was like a 2-story sort of condo type thing. What's that?
That was a phenomenal place.
Oh yeah, it was great. And most of the time, the neighbors were they sort of we kept it as low as we could, but we had really some good times there. And then the last one was when we lived over a record store on Kerr Street. That one was we didn't get evicted because there was nobody there. There was no neighbors. We lived above a record store. It was Records on Wheels. And there was no neighbors to interrupt. I mean, it was like massive parties there all the time. It was a good spot in the dodgy side of Oakville, if there is such a thing.
Well, like even there, even at that place, the one up on Upper Middle, when you went out in the balcony, you were surrounded by neighbors.
Oh yeah.
But on Kerr, there was nothing. And you're right. Like there were stores across the street that all closed.
Yeah.
And
I remember there be
had ample parking.
Yeah, somebody was out in the front. Let's say on the front balcony. I remember somebody was out there, and I guess some metalheads or something drove by, and they were shouting, expletives going, you effing punks, and then it's going back and forth, and they get out of their car like they're going to do something about it, and then everybody starts pouring out of the party onto the balcony, and they're like, yeah, on second thought, we'll get back in our car and leave. Because we had a lot of people in that building.
Yeah, well, and one of the few times that like you weren't outnumbered as punks, right?
Yeah, and every year we held I don't know, maybe you attended some of these. We had the anti-Christmas Christmas Eve party.
Oh yeah,
it was
yeah.
legendary.
Yeah,
I mean, every punk in Oakville, Burlington area, everybody was always at this December 24th, the anti-Christmas Christmas Eve party, and it was an absolute drink fest.
I always remember, for some reason at the parties, the band always ended up playing, not hype, but the band, like, the night they drove Old Dixie down and all that stuff, somehow always ended up playing on the radio or on the stereo somehow. And it just turned into a big sing-along. Everybody at some point would be like, they'd be just so hammered, and then we're all singing the band songs.
Yeah.
Let me ask you about the role the punk houses play in the scene. Because I find that there's quite a few. But we don't really give them the academic time that we should.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you could sort of take a moment to give us some things, because I think of them as like, safe spaces for punks. I think of them as places that punks come to. They gravitate. People get to know each other there. They come practice spaces, rehearsal spaces. So they sort of perform a lot of functions in terms of scene building. And I don't think we actually talk a bit about them, but you've already mentioned some of these things, like a party, like it becomes a social gathering place.
For us, it was, there wasn't any rehearsal there, but it was very much a social. But you're right, all the places, it was especially important for touring bands to have a place to go, because it's expensive to tour, and there's not a lot of money.
And hotels are sort of out of the picture. Right?
Yeah, it's kind of a safe haven for somebody to crash, and you're taken care of and you're fed and that kind of thing. So you kind of take care of the bands coming through. But it becomes a mutual thing as you go out on tour, right? Absolutely. And that's why, you mentioned about hype going on some shows versus other shows. We had reciprocal arrangements where if let's say we went to Vancouver, so you'd have some of the biggest bands in Vancouver opening for hype. Well, it was reciprocal that if the Dayglos or Death Sentence came to Toronto, we were obligated to open for them. Because they did us a solid in Vancouver, so we're going to do them a solid here. If the Unwanted played for us in Winnipeg, then we're going to play for them here. It was kind of a quid pro quo. You looked after each other, but it becomes a networking tool, right? In some ways, right? And these houses, you're right. Some of them, like let's say October Crisis in London, they had quite the facility where not only was it a place for bands to crash, but it was a recording place. It was where bands rehearsed. It was like the central social place for the London punk scene, which was important. And that's why, there was a time where I think I was with Stretch Marks actually in London, and the promoter that I knew from Ottawa was there, and the promoter from Montreal was there.
The key players.
Shithead.
Yeah.
And we were sitting there going, you know what, we need to create a network, because it's hard to get bands across the network. Across the border, and so we came up with this unofficial network where primarily I was the point person, because they would come to Toronto first, and I would go, if you come across, MDC or whomever, I can guarantee you shows in London, I can guarantee you shows in Montreal and Ottawa,
which makes
by
it
reputable promoters.
Which makes it more worth it to cross the border.
Exactly.
Right. Okay.
What kind of problems did you encounter with bringing any bands over? Did you run into that as a
Yeah,
hurdle?
Some bands would try and get across and find out that they had, there were legal issues. MDC is one, they could not get across the border with their equipment. I can't remember why, but they phoned and said, look, we can't get across the border. We know a band, wherever they were, Detroit or Buffalo. We're going to dump our equipment. Can you loan us some? I said, yeah, you can take, guitars, everything. So I said, Hype will lend you all their equipment, and no problem. So drum kits, everything, we got you covered.
Dave Dichter was arrested playing at the show that they played at the Turning Point.
Did they?
And they had to stay at the quarantine house while they were going through the court proceedings. And it was that pre-arrest that gave them trouble coming across the border. Just for the record.
I thought it was
And apparently-
Franco and one of the other guys.
It was
not Dave.
sorry, you're right. It was
Yeah.
Franco. We were talking about that in the No Mind
Yeah,
Dance.
it wasn't
Yeah.
Dave.
But also, I think it was they got arrested for having like a paring knife or something, like something super
That was
ridiculous.
later. That was
Yeah.
at the
Oh,
Anarchist.
was that different?
Yeah, because they went through their van and they saw the more dead cop or millions of dead cops.
That doesn't go over well.
No, and they went and they arrested them for having a tire iron. I think
Right.
that's the one when they had to
Right.
come back. It's like, oh, well, that's in my van anyway.
Yeah,
If
in
you're,
case you need to change a fly.
yeah, if you're going to have a name like that, then yeah, you're putting yourself out there to get slapped.
Yeah.
But good band though.
One of the bands that you put on at the DMC that was the Freeze, and they always had issues.
Yeah.
How did you get them across the border?
They had no trouble getting across the border when I did them, and when Freeze was, we loved the Freeze. I mean, their albums were phenomenal. You know, from the first time we ever heard Broken Bones, that was a great song. We just loved the Freeze, their style, their lyrics, everything about the Freeze. And I remember being a little disappointed when I first met them. Because some bands just show up and you go, there's a relationship immediately, and some are a little standoffish. The first thing that Cliffhanger said to me, as I remember, he got out of the van. I said, "Hi, I'm Don," and he said, "Where can I score some heroin?" And for me, that was in another stratosphere of I don't even know what to do with that. I was a little shocked by it.
I've done an interview with him before, and he was talking about going through a lot of mental health issues at the time, and he was using heroin to self-medicate as so. Not using that as an excuse.
No, but
it is a shocking first
because
impression, right?
There were always drugs, but it was
Yeah.
hash, pot, maybe acid, whatever. But that was in another
That was a
world.
different bygone era. Yeah, for sure. But the Freeze also, so they had some difficulty crossing, or
Not when I had them.
But
Not that I recall.
did they go back and because you seem to you put on a couple of shows sort of back to back, but not right. Like there's a show here in April in 1985, and then there's a show in June 1985 with 76% uncertain. And I'm thinking, they came back sort of pretty quickly.
Yeah,
They must have enjoyed the first show, and I'm thinking, did they also tell other people from Boston? Like, did the word get out in Boston area? Because I mentioned something about the Knot, and then I'm wondering if they're like, I thought, there was this thing with Reuben Kincade and bringing a number of Boston bands here.
Probably because I mean I don't know why they would have come back so soon, but I do remember this show because we had just launched the album, and we actually went with. I don't know if Freeze followed us, but I know 76% uncertain in us went to Montreal together.
Okay.
But everything back then was a lot of word of mouth. I mean, you didn't know who you could trust. When you were going on the road, it was a big deal. So you would talk to other bands, try and find out who's good, who's not good as far as a promoter. And it got to the point where, because I was promoting, when I would book with other promoters across the country, I would become familiar with who was good, who was bad. And I started putting in my own rider into the agreements for Hype when we would go on tour, explicitly saying and pointing out to them, look, I'm a promoter. I know how this is supposed to work. This is what I expect to see. But we're not asking for red jelly beans or any shit like that.
Yeah.
When I roll into the city, make no mistake, I'm going to be watching and looking to make sure that you promoted the show. And I expect ding, 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 ding. This is what a good promoter does. And so I actually put that into our agreements.
In some ways, it creates standards for what's like sort of fair treatment of bands, right?
Yeah, because nobody wants to spend all that time roll into, especially a big market like Toronto, where a band is going to roll in and they're going to need, not that it comes back to money, but a big city is where you get the most amount of money that's going to propel you on for the next few days or maybe a week on smaller shows where you don't make a lot of money or maybe a break even or even lose money. That's going to keep you going until you hit the next big market, whether it's Montreal, New York, whatever. You need those big hits along the way to keep going because there's a lot of small stuff in between that's not going to pay the bills.
So I see you sort of building the networking blocks that you need to start doing the next thing that managers usually do, which is a tour. And I think in 1985, maybe the summer of 1985,
Mm-hmm.
do you recall?
I
think Hype goes on tour, right?
Yep.
So can you tell us a bit about this first Hype tour?
Sure.
Where did it go? When was it? You said the summer.
Yeah,
so.
it was always the summer. It was usually, I think it was August, early September is usually when we did it. So part of August, maybe early September. We'd go out for 2-3 weeks at a time. Everybody had jobs, so they really couldn't just stop and go for forever and just tour ad nauseum. That first tour, we learned an incredible amount of stuff, how to tour properly, because we didn't do it well.
Did you go in the States or just Canada?
No, we actually we couldn't get back into the States because we made a terrible mistake at the border at an earlier date where we had a show booked in Buffalo, and we thought we would smuggle all our equipment across the border, and we had this brilliant idea that we'd do it in 2 different cars. And so we had all of this equipment packed into the car, hidden away, and then we had, the 2 cars full of all of our, us and our sort of contingent. And we thought, okay, what we're going to do is one car is going to go, and then the other car will show up like 15 minutes later at the border, and they'll go through a different line or whatever, and it'll be fine. Well, we did that, except that the lineup at the border was so long that the car that was supposed to be like forever behind us
15 minutes
ends up right behind us. And stupidly, we've got 3 sets of biological brothers, and they're all interspersed between
in
the 2
different cars.
So you're going through and you're going, yeah, I don't know these guys. And they're like, yeah, secondary. So we all got pulled over, and the guys were, the border.
All of you?
Oh, all of us.
So none of you got through?
Nobody got through. So the U.S. border guys, they were quite nice, but they were kind of like, look, you can lie to us, and we're going to take you in the back, and we're going to do the full search, pull up the glove, whatnot. But, are you telling me you don't know each other? Because seriously, there's like 3 biological brothers on each side here in 2 different cars, same addresses, same names, and you're kind of like, we're screwed. We totally pooched this. And you go, you're banned. And so we just packed our stuff up and went back.
So banned as in like a one-time ban?
As a band, we tried to get in illegally to work in the U.S. We didn't follow the proper procedures. So, we just never even bothered to try again.
So you went to Canada?
Yeah.
So where did you go? East, west?
East to west. So we never made it past Montreal.
So that's sort of the furthest east?
Yeah, it's too long a haul to the Maritimes. Would have loved to have done it, but again, the economics is just way too long a haul to get that far out. So Montreal, Ottawa, Sault Ste. Marie was something that no one ever went to.
Yeah.
She knew a guy that ran the one record store in Sault Ste. Marie, so he would put on a show for us at this hall underneath a bowling alley, and every kid in this city would show up because it was a big freaking deal that a punk band was coming through Sault Ste. Marie and was stopping. We sold more T-shirts. I mean, it was they treat you like rock stars. Quite frankly, it was kind of odd, but to stop there was a great way to pull up some cash to keep moving. Long way to Winnipeg.
Yeah.
And they just loved it. I mean, you come back this next time and there's like, 70 people standing in the audience with a hype shirt on. It's like, that's kind of weird. So, we do Winnipeg, which was always abysmal. Regina was always over the top fantastic. Edmonton, Calgary, Kelowna, Vancouver, and then back again.
Okay, so in Still Thinking #1, you disclose about this tour. You say you talked about not you, but I think the band did. They talk about Winnipeg being awful, and they said you hit it twice, and they didn't make it up the second time. It was even worse.
Yeah,
but you do give accolades to Edmonton, Calgary, Regina, and Montreal as being great scenes. Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a bit about the rave reviews behind them? Because I think this would have been your first maybe exposure to punk scenes across Canada, right?
Yep.
So what were the other? Did you see something building? Did you see something going on?
There was definitely like very tight scenes in most of the cities. I mean, Winnipeg just didn't. I mean, we showed up there and we're in this bar and we're like, why is there a bed in the middle of the floor, in the dance floor? What we didn't understand is that it was a strip club that was about to open as a strip club, and then later it would be they'd pull away the bed and put it away somewhere. And honest to God, there was a big, huge bed in the middle of the dance floor, and we're like, what is this? And then no one would show up in Winnipeg except for the stretch marks. They would show up and maybe, 40, 50 other kids. The promoters there weren't very good. One time we showed up and the promoter's nowhere, and somebody says, oh, he's at a soccer game. What the hell is that? But Edmonton was a rockin' scene.
They
Calgary
did have the
was
Winnipeg
great.
Fury. They were worth watching.
Yeah. I don't know how the Unwanted or Beyond Possession or any of those guys managed to survive in Winnipeg, because it's like East Berlin in winter. But
the House of Beep.
Yeah.
In the Personality Crisis book, they talk about the House of Beep.
Okay.
Being
I
one
don't
of the
remember that.
So it was through punk houses, I think, is more how it happened.
We actually did finally I think on the third tour, we had a phenomenal show in a big, huge warehouse there in Winnipeg, and that redeemed it. But the first couple of tours were like, well, Regina was one of those places where it was a big deal if somebody came through. Like, if Government Issue came through, that was a big deal. Hype and S.N.F.U. actually ended up playing together in Regina, and that was a massive, big deal for them. It was a great club, and everybody would show up, and it was a great scene, and there were no fights. Everybody got along, and Edmonton had their own scene with their own. They had their own sort of punk house. I can't remember what it was called, but it was where everybody hung out. You'd go and party there after the shows. Calgary was the same way. They had this club called 10 Foot Henry's, which was phenomenal, and then the local bands were really great. We got along with them really well, and there was this place called the Manor, Calgary Manor, where all the touring bands would stay, and so we stayed there, and it was an old. Apparently, it's like this giant old mansion that at some point was doing illegal abortions way back in the days, and it just looked like this gothic mansion sitting on this hill in between all these freeways, and that was punk central for Calgary, and everybody would be there. And Vancouver was more violent than Toronto for some reason. There was a lot of violence in the shows. Seemed like a lot of factions, skinheads. Very much a strong Europe influence. A lot of the exploited GBH type of that type of punk, as opposed to maybe the social distortion California punk that was sort of Toronto-ish a little bit. It was great shows though.
So So after you come back from some of these tours, I remember reading an interview. It might have been Hype, but I thought it might have been one of your columns, Reuben's Ramblings, where you talk about you sort of have this moment about how great the Toronto scene is. What made the Toronto scene different from some of these other scenes that you had now visited? Because now you would have some experience, right, with them.
I think it was just obviously dramatically bigger than all the other scenes. I mean, when you can have local acts, where some of the shows that we were doing was you get.
With the bigness, do you get diversity in bands, like different types of bands and things like that? Is that what you're...
The other scenes were very much what you'd see traditional punk, or you'd see people that were just going because it was the one thing to do in town. Whereas in Toronto, when we first started, the skinheads seemed to disappear in Toronto. I don't know where they went.
So that's what I was going to ask you about, because that seemed to be a key factor in thwarting a lot of other scenes, and Toronto not having a skinhead problem.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, we mentioned the Goofs, and the Goofs seemed to be one of the people that kept the skinheads at bay, right? Because
that was the case.
There was a war between them during at least 1 or 2 summers, and lots of the skinheads got locked up and left town, like it was minimized, right? Whereas you'd go to Montreal and it was a different thing, right?
Yeah, they were all different, but
Hamilton was sometimes different too. Like there was a
Hamilton
skinhead scene there too. So I'm thinking, like, do you think? So I'm wondering, what do you think? I think Toronto had this sort of skinhead-free problem, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
In some ways, that allowed it to flourish in ways.
And there was I don't even know how it started, but I guess when you started getting the speed metal bands and you had people with longer hair starting to show up and check out some of our shows. And I know initially outside of Turning Point there was some friction between punks and the metalheads.
They were warring factions.
Yeah,
for sure.
And then eventually it just went away. And in Toronto you would see, any type of, whether it's skate punk, straight edge, sort of European style, American style, hardcore, long hairs, reggae, black people in punk rock. That was a Toronto thing. You didn't see that anywhere else, and it didn't seem to matter here. And I don't know that it mattered anywhere else, or maybe there just weren't a lot of people that were into punk or had exposure to it. But here, it was embraced. It was like, I don't care. It's like gay, straight. It doesn't matter. It's just all part of the same scene. A lot of girls in the Toronto scene, whereas other ones, it was primarily a male thing. I don't know. It's just bigger crowds, more diverse, and it seemed very much more organized. And it was probably more organized because the number of shows that were going on, where a promoter, whomever it was, whether it was Jill, myself, Al, or whoever was doing shows, you could quickly cross-promote future shows. And then eventually somebody came up with a brilliant idea. They have the TO hardcore hotline, that phone number with an answering machine.
Yeah.
Like the movie guy or whatever.
I don't know if many scenes had that either.
No, I mean, it seemed very organized. And then you had the record peddler as this sort of anchor to the entire community that word of mouth got out. And
It was a place for people to sell records and go to records and also meet each other, right?
Yeah.
I mean, constantly people would meet at the record peddler.
I think that's one of the reasons why you didn't run into the same type of problems that you had in Montreal or the other scenes when it came to a lot of the violence, especially when the metal influence came into the scene, because you had Larry's Hideaway that put on everything.
Yep.
And, so you would have cross-pollination in that sense, because you'd have the punks inadvertently seeing the metal shows, and they had the metalheads inadvertently seeing the punk shows. And then you had one record store, really, in Toronto that would actually have all that stuff, and that was the record peddler.
Yep.
You'd also have a culture that was developed through a radio show, Aggressive Rock, if I could mention that, because Aggressive Rock actually played music from both scenes. And as the next generation came in, they didn't know about necessarily the war between each other, like the metalheads and the punk kids, and were willing to maybe give it a chance, right? Especially because their scenes were smaller and there was less to do, right? So you were definitely looking for something to do, and I think these cultures started coming together instead of veering apart.
And Toronto had, the advantage of having multiple university college stations.
Yes,
CFNY, for whatever it is now turned into, was, pushing the envelope back then. It did stray into our areas sometimes. And then you had the new music, which was really pushing a lot of the new stuff. So although, sometimes it often didn't go into the hardcore area, there was a hotbed of activity in Toronto, and a lot of stuff that, my wife was from Regina. She'd never even heard of some of this stuff. And it's like their sphere of influence just doesn't extend there, whereas in Toronto, you found out about everything. You just found out about stuff and explored it and talked to people, and you found out about new bands and new genres and little twists to the punk, the tree of life, as it were. Some bands like 7 Seconds were this whole straight edge thing, and they had a certain sound to them, and then others like Social Distortion were a completely different thing, and everybody found their groove, or they loved everything.
And to me, the 2 points of how you found out anything back then were record peddler. You would go there and you'd hear about shows, you'd buy tapes by new bands and all of that, and then from Arg Rock. And so before we started taping this, you were mentioning about listening to Arg Rock out in Oakville. How did that come about?
How we discovered it, I can't remember, but I remember you're talking about that's CKLN?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So CKLN had this punk hardcore show, and so that was another way to get exposed to all of this stuff. And we loved listening to it, and I think it was every Tuesday night. And the only place in Oakville that...
And at one point, they had Maximum Rock and Roll after it.
Yeah.
So you would get 2 hours of punk. Yeah.
And so the only time only place in Oakville you could actually get reception to for whatever reason was this car wash in Oakville in the middle of this mall. And so we would all literally gather every Tuesday night and stand there in a car wash, listening to the radio, to CKLN, hearing bands that we'd never heard before.
So it was broadcast out of Ryerson. It had a 50-watt transmitter, which is a small transmitter. No, I think it was 200 watt. 200 watts?
200 watts.
It was low.
Yeah.
But because of where Oakville is located, it didn't have to go around the highway. It just
went
cut
over the
across the lake, right?
Yeah.
Which would give you better reception.
So you guys are all hanging out around a car wash,
Yes.
listening to, and like someone would be playing it
sometimes
in their car, I guess?
We'd be standing outside the car or whatever, and it's in the dead of winter sometimes, so you're just standing there.
So you're
and
suffering.
Inevitably, the police show up, and in Oakville, people loitering around doing something, that's you got to call in the SWAT team.
That's a crime, man.
So then you got four cop cars show up, and they're like, "What are you doing?" And it's like, "Well, we got a bunch of punk rockers here. Something's about to happen." It's like, no, we're just standing here listening to a station that broadcast from some college in Toronto, and this is the only place we get it. They don't get that. Go away. Do something else.
You were mentioning CFNY. They were a commercial station. There's a person named Liz Janik who works there.
Janik, yeah.
Yeah. What is her relationship to Hype, her association?
Somehow, I guess she was doing a show on Sundays, and I think it was something to do
You
with...
mentioned her being a producer, or was she on-air host or something?
I think maybe she was an on-air host, but there was some show that they used to run on Sundays where they would do indie music, and so they would actually push beyond like CFNY would do, you'd hear Killing Joke on there, you'd hear sometimes Dead Kennedys or whatnot. But there was this one show where...
It's more the hits, though, of New Wave and
Yes.
stuff like that, yeah.
Still good stuff at the time, but it wasn't,
I remember the Cars and the Vapors and all that stuff, whatever.
And then somehow she was playing our stuff, and we'd hear Hype on the radio on CFNY. And
Which is crazy.
Which is crazy. We're like, what? This is wild. And then I don't know how, but I recall I was on the phone with Liz Janik. I don't know if she phoned me, if I'd reached out going, thanks for playing our I don't know how that happened, but she was talking to me about, the importance of the local scene, and she liked Hype for whatever reason. That's okay, cool. That's why she was playing the record on the radio.
Well, it might have been also one of the few records, right?
It might have been. And
not to belittle Hypes, because I do think Hype were a great band, but I also think that there wasn't that many releases at that time.
Maybe it helps with CanCon as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's always there, right?
So what happened?
It was just this knowing that she liked us and that she would play us, and we got more airtime on CFNY, albeit on the Sunday show. And then I remember her saying, "You guys should do a video and give it to Much Music, because chances are they'd air it, because back then there was." They would air stuff.
They were probably hungry for content.
Yeah. And that's why we ended up doing that video at the bridge, or whatever it's called at the time, where we did this Hype video. I don't think I ever sent it to Much Music, because I don't think I ever liked it that much. I thought, this, you have these grand ideas, and these guys were like amateur video guys, and they did this video, and you kind of look after and go,
do you know what song you did
okay.
the video for? Do you know what song
was it Burned or White Disease? Or
it was Burned, I think.
Was it Burned? Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, we put the video up a few weeks ago on the Facebook page.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting footage, and there's one funny shot where John Barbason's old girlfriend jumps up on stage, gives him a kiss, which he thought was odd. But I mean, it was a good video, but it's not something that I could see being aired on Much Music, so I didn't bother.
Well, in hindsight, it's kind of neat to have a video shot at the bridge. Yeah. I mean, there wasn't a whole lot of people with video cameras back then, and so to have a little bit of a time capsule.
I was talking to my brother last night about it. I said, you know what? I know I have it somewhere in the basement. My basement's a disaster. And I know I've got film. We videotaped a ton of stuff on our second tour. And I've got hours and hours and hours of video of Hype on tour, stupid antics in the van, and
you need to do something with this.
I need to find it, and I need to digitize it, and then do something with it, because there's some interesting stuff in there.
We need to find you some video people to work with.
Yeah.
Because we'd love to see what you have. So I want to go back to a couple of things. Because we've been jumping back and forth.
Sure.
Burned is from a later period. I wanted to mention there's some more shows here at DMZ I wanted to ask you about. So there's this one you were mentioning. Vince was mentioning something about a band called Ignorance. Is that true? Can you tell? You want to preface a question about Ignorance?
Well, Ignorance was a band from Mississauga, and John Barbazan's band, who eventually ended up joining Hype.
Okay. That's probably true.
So we wonder, if this is your introduction to the next lineup of Hype.
It very probably was. I mean, they were probably just another local band that asked to be, can I get on a show? And yeah, sure. And I know we eventually found Steve, who was on Decimation, who became one of our guitarists later in the lineup. But yeah, I think John maybe was from Ignorance. I don't recall entirely, but I know we knew him somehow and tried him out, and it just worked out. And then his brother came along. Well, as soon as Chris
Dave
left, it was like, Dave, little baby Dave, that kid could play drums
Guy's
like
a maniac.
nobody's business. Oh yeah,
He could hit hard.
I mean, Chris could play wickedly fast, but Dave was an exceptional drummer.
Yeah.
They were both really good drummers. Different styles, but Dave was really, really good.
Dave was a little bit more fluid. Chris was very regimented when he played.
Yeah. Oh, and Chris would play in army boots.
Yeah.
And other people go, how the hell do you play drums wearing army boots?
But Hype were blessed with two incredible drummers.
Yeah. And he was so sweet. I mean, it's terrible that he died in a fire out in Vancouver. He was a phenomenal drummer, but he was so innocent and pure and naive that, we're on tour, and we'd be bugging him, going, Dave, there are girls out there that are like they're all over you. They love you. And he's like, what? But they were flirting with him. They were all over him, but he didn't know. Yeah.
Well, I like the scream that he let out on Burned when
On
for
Wipeout.
Wipeout.
Yeah,
because he smashed his hand when he dropped his stick.
that's it exactly. So he smashed his hand and he did this wicked scream, and we went, that's a keeper. So we reran the song again and said, let's do the stop, and then you do that scream, and he did it, and it was perfect.
He broke his hand?
No.
Okay.
Although Chris burnt his hand one time.
Oh, really?
Yeah. He worked at Old Fort York, and he was one of those soldier guys. And he had a musket or something flare up in his hand, so he burned his hand. Maybe that's why we missed some shows. I have no idea.
Oh. I want to ask you about this beach party show that takes place at the DMZ. So it's Hype, Sudden Impact, and Social Suicide, which is, to me, an iconic lineup from the Toronto hardcore period. And this is in 1985. There's a bring a skateboard to win a draw for a free entry to all future RKP shows.
That was the dumbest idea.
But I wonder, the beach party, is it because it was the summer?
Yeah, it was a summer thing. We were trying to, Sudden Impact was totally into the skating thing. Milo and Reed and those guys. And so I tried to, this was DMZ. There was a lot of floor space. I thought, let's sort of make it into a sort of a beach party thing. Bring a skateboard. You get skate around while there's thrashing and whatnot, which probably wasn't the most brilliant idea. And then this whole idea of here you get a draw and.
But it's like, let's try something different.
Yeah, you win a lifetime entry into all my shows in the future. How the hell is that supposed to work? So really didn't think it through very well.
Sure, yeah.
I don't know who won. I have no idea.
It would be somebody who was always on your guest list.
But we always, the guys always loved playing with Sudden Impact, and then there was a point where we made a conscious decision. We really shouldn't play with them anymore because they should be standing on their own as a headlining act. They were a phenomenal band. They were tight, musically really good. Their lyrics were fantastic. They needed to step up and be recognized. And they just needed that push. And I remember Milo, I was talking to Milo about it all the time. And it's like, you guys rock. And I think they didn't think they were as good as they were. And, a lot of bands were like that, including some of the guys in Hype. You had to push them to go, you deserve to take that next step.
They would go on to put on an album on Fringe, and then I think Diabolical Force, which was sort of a subsidiary label. I wanted to ask you about Fringe because I wondered if, your first record comes out. Did you self-distribute it? Did Fringe help you? Did the connection with the record peddler help? Was there any sort of help with that?
Again, that was another learning curve. So
because Fringe comes to put out the second record, right? And I think there's another story behind that. But I want to introduce Fringe and who Fringe were. Who were the people behind Fringe Records?
Well, Fringe was a record label that was run by the same guy who owned the record peddler.
That was
Ben Hoffman.
Ben Hoffman.
Yep. So they started up Fringe. I don't know who the first bands were that they put on Fringe. I can't remember. But at the time, Fringe didn't exist.
Youth 12-inch comes out on that label, right?
Did they?
Yeah.
Okay. At the time, it didn't seem to be a going concern. I didn't know about it. When the first album came out, we had to self-distribute. So I'd go to the record peddler. They'd say, okay, I'll take 100 albums on consignment or whatever, or for a fixed fee, and then we'd close the deal. And then you'd start working the same deal with other distribution, Dutch East, India, all the record distribution channels that are out there, and send. And I figured out I needed to send out records to.
But Fringe would have been the first, right? Because they would have been the easiest.
Locally, going to the record peddler was step one.
Yeah,
you need your stuff in market, and then we'd go to the Records on Wheels and distribute that way. But ultimately, like Records on Wheels and whatnot, they would get a lot of the product directly from the record peddler's warehouse. So a lot of that stuff was distributed for us by them.
Okay, can you tell me a bit about the second record, Burned? Because it comes out on Fringe Records, but I wondered if Reuben Kincade was supposed to do the second record.
No.
Or did Fringe approach you? How did the second record come together on Fringe?
So ultimately, we knew we were going to do a second record. We had the content, and we were just moving along, and we were going to do it ourselves. That was just the way it was. And then I can't remember how we got reached out to, but got contacted by Fringe, and they said, we are interested in adding the next Hype album to the Fringe library. And we're like, okay. So we went down, we met with Ben, and it was on Brian Taylor's recommendation. So circle back long term, we owe him a debt of gratitude.
Of course, yeah.
So Brian was giving the nod. He was sort of like the subject matter expert for Ben. And he gave him the nod going, this is something you need to
pay attention to.
Pay attention to.
Yeah.
So Fringe, we went down, I met with Ben, and we, figured out the contract and what we're going to do. And then we had the agreement to do it. And then he said, look, now I just need you to record it. I need the artwork. I need, what we're going to do with how we're going to make the album look and all this stuff. So we had full license on that. And we went, I think we got an advance from Fringe to help us with some of the recording costs. And then we went to a studio that was in Oakville that had, we became aware of, that had worked with the Spoons and Triumph Soundpath Studios. And this producer, engineer called Rick Lightheart, he said, I've never done this before. He said, let's give it a whirl. And it was
he had recorded bands though, not a hardcore band.
Oh no, he'd never done hardcore. So, but he thought it was.
So
really
that can often be met with disastrous effects.
Yeah, but he was giving us tips and things.
Did Neil record the first one?
Yes, he did.
So how come you changed record?
At this point, Neil had moved on and was doing his own sound engineering stuff, and yeah, it was just not that we didn't think Neil was good enough. He had exited the scene, so to speak.
Well, I wondered if there was, that board might have still existed at one of these houses, and would you have recorded there? So I guess you did a first self-release one, and then you did like sort of a more professional kind of
we could have easily done back in Brian's basement, the same rehearsal studio that we were working in, but we decided to actually go to professional studios since we had the money. We wanted to make a better record, and so we did it there. And I think it came out pretty well. At times, I think it's been over-engineered. I was hoping for a little bit more depth in the grittiness of it, but I was happy with it.
Okay, I'm going to skip back to Burned a little later.
Sure.
I want to go back to some other shows because this seems to be an iconic show in the Toronto scene, which was the 7 Seconds show. So you mentioned that they were part of the BYO connection. Tell me about the importance of 7 Seconds. Who were they?
Who are they?
Yeah.
They were, the hottest band. They were one of the biggest bands in the scene at the time, in the entire punk scene at the time. 7 Seconds was massive. I think because they weren't total hardcore thrash. They had sing-alongs. They almost crossed every genre. I know they were very hardcore, straight edge, whatnot.
You talked about how inclusive the Toronto scene was.
Yeah.
I feel like they had like Not Just Boys Fun was one of their songs, so they invited women into the pit. They seem to be pro queer, they seem to have like everything. They seem to be like all inclusive and all accepting, and it seemed like a natural fit for a Toronto scene. Yeah, in some ways.
Yeah, and having a record, walk together, rock together.
Oh, that was massive. The
messaging too about it, it's just.
I think that was that tour actually for that record.
Yeah, because this looks like the drawing from that record.
Yeah, it would have been. So 7 Seconds was, everything that should be good about punk was 7 Seconds. They were very socially conscious, very, you could just slap the label. They were good onto almost everything they did. Whereas you look at a band like Fear. Okay, well they were interested to listen to, but they were off the charts on some things, and they certainly weren't good. As 7 Seconds, they were trying. I think they were following the BYO thing. I don't know by design or whatnot, but they really wanted to make a social change within the scene. Everybody inclusive. Everybody does the right thing for the right reasons. They were a massive act. They were. I don't think they were ever as big as the Dead Kennedys. But certainly up there with the Circle Jerks, they were iconic. So for a chance for us to do 7 Seconds, that was one of the things where all those shows, with Unwanted or S.N.F.U. or
this would become huge.
These were the stretch marks. Stretch marks. These were the steps that ultimately got me to a 7 Seconds where I'm like, this is for me the big leagues. This was a big show, and I remember the crowd was huge, and I remember actually not letting anybody into the DMZ for Normally people just walk in. I actually kept the doors shut and staged it so that there was this massive crowd outside to build up the energy. It was it was one of those stupid promoter stunts, but it worked. It was a fantastic show.
This is one of the questions that came to my mind, is that as we look through all these flyers, there's been a lot of great shows. Which ones stood out the most to you? Obviously, 7 Seconds is one of them.
Yeah, 7 Seconds.
Well, I wanted to ask you about this one
Sure,
before
go ahead.
because that's an important question to ask. But I wanted to ask you: was the Circle Pit born in this show? The Circle Pit that comes to Toronto. So Circle Pits became sort of an iconic thing more at Ildico's and the Bridge. But I had heard that it was actually born at this DMZ show, and I'm wondering if you can recall that, if you remember a moment where people were dancing around in a circle.
I don't remember which show, but it very well could have been this one because there was a certain point where you're right.
I want to believe it was this show.
Yeah.
But I don't know if it is.
It makes sense that it would be. I mean, it was the right type of floor space. It was.
But you don't remember.
No.
Okay, so I don't want to feed this rumor if it's not true.
Two strikes on that story, eh?
Sorry.
I know. But I'm not finished asking it.
Keep
Well, you gotta remember,
living it. Live that dream.
I'm trying to find somebody who can.
Most of my time was spent at the door
So,
watching the money like
with
a
that-
friggin' hawk.
Yeah, you had your back to the stage.
Yeah.
most
So,
of it. Yeah.
but Toronto in its circle thrashing that was another unique thing about Toronto. Every other scene around, there was no circle thrashing. And I remember Hype actually in St. Louis, in Sault Ste. Marie.
I was very proud of that circle thrash.
Yeah.
And
We
for
were
different
trying to
reasons.
teach the kids there how to do it. They
For
just
different
couldn't get
reasons. But for different reasons. So, what are your thoughts on this? What are your thoughts on the circle thrash?
I thought it was a great way for everybody to get involved without getting hurt. I mean,
That's what I thought too.
It was. I mean, it was like the perfect thing. Slam dancing. I mean, I did it. When DOA was in town or whatever, and you'd get an elbow in the face or whatnot, and sometimes a fight would break out.
Yeah.
This was like the perfect thing that guys and girls could all just thrash along, and it was like it was lethargic. I mean, you were just like,
Yeah.
pumping away and going in a circle, and sometimes you'd hit the stage and then do a flip and come into the crowd. It was actually one of the coolest things about the scene.
It was one of the amazing dances that came out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I remember the circle thrash when at the Bridge, or Ildico's, whatever it was called at the time, caused massive issues for the business underneath, because there was so much circle thrashing going on. I mean, hundreds of people moving in a circle, that dust and ceiling tile were literally falling off the ceiling into the whatever it was, a pool room or whatever it was downstairs. Oh yeah, they were furious. You get that many people moving in a circle?
Did they give you grief as a promoter? Were they coming up and?
No, they come up and give the bar the grief, and the bar says, "Go away."
So I don't want to forget that question about your observations about some of the biggest bands, but maybe I want to ask it at the end if that's okay. I want to go back into some other things because you've already mentioned Problem Children being an important band. Can you tell me a bit about Problem Children, because I want to get your thoughts on some of these bands, because I feel that people who lived it have definitely sort of cemented opinions about like what they sounded like, what their importance was, what their role was. So tell me about Problem Children. They were from Dunnville, which is outside of Hamilton. Can you tell me about where's Dunnville? For the person who doesn't know what Dunnville is, the pit between two signs, which is a song that they wrote.
I have no idea. I mean,
Okay, well,
I couldn't drive there right now. I'd have to look it on a map.
it's near Hamilton, regardless.
Yeah.
So they were considered sort of a Hamilton band, but they certainly played Toronto more often than anything.
I consider them a Toronto band.
So do we.
Yeah.
So tell me about Problem Children. Who were they? Because you talked about them being like so good that they could be a headliner.
Yeah, I mean they started off obviously as a young band, and they a little sloppy at the beginning, but they had this melodic way about their songs, and their songs were catchy. Maybe a little like I always thought a little Asexuals, a little Social Distortion-y.
Oh yeah. Sure. Yeah.
In fact, there was a video, I can't remember who did it, but where Another State of Mind, the song, somebody had done a collage against the soundtrack of the Social Distortion's Another State of Mind song, and there was a scene where Problem Children were up on stage, and I went, that fits. that absolutely fits. And I just thought Problem Children, eventually they evolved to, their musicianship was really good. Their songs were top notch. They were really catchy. They were a really good band. And that's why I say like them and Sudden Impact. I hope I point those two out in particular because I could see early on that they were going to be something special. They were going to be a top band, and they could go on tour if they wanted to. They could do an album if they wanted to, and I think they would be embraced. And I think Problem Children ultimately did that. I didn't keep track of them, but I think
They
put
did.
out-
They went to tour Europe and
Yeah.
they started putting out more records, and I think they
Yeah.
had 4 full length releases. They became a huge band.
Yeah.
Social Suicide were also a band that I felt definitely were coming up, and they were from Brantford. Can you tell me? Do you recall them?
I recall them, but I don't recall
What they
the
sounded like or
music or it's just,
Much
there
about
was
them.
so many. Again, it falls back to a lot of smaller bands looking for shows, and that was my job. I saw that as my job is to get them on the bill.
This was one of the last shows at Larry's. It looks like the
I always liked
DMZ.
that poster.
The DMZ is closed down. Do you know about the artwork? Can you tell me?
I found it somewhere. Like all of these I did myself.
This is amazing artwork. I don't know who drew it.
I didn't draw it, but
Yeah.
I found it somewhere. It might
Yeah,
have
you
been
put
in a-
together the collage of it,
Yeah.
which is it's
Probably
great
not.
artwork. I don't know.
Well, because
It looks like Godcore's artwork, but
Yeah.
I'm not sure.
with hype and sending your records to all of these community radio stations across North America and all of the fanzines and whatnot, there was constantly mail coming in, whether it's playlists or fanzines and whatnot. So I had all of this artwork that was coming that nobody here would have ever seen.
Yeah.
That maybe was from a fanzine in North Dakota or someplace. And I go, that's a cool artwork. I want to
Yeah,
use that.
let's turn it into something here. Yeah.
So there's a lot of plagiarism.
No, well, I'm sure. Yeah. Let me ask, but it looks like the DMZ is closed down. Can you tell me about how the DMZ might have closed? Because this is a Larry show, and this is in '86, so this is later, right?
Yeah,
And this looks like the last Larry show, so that
might
that
have
leads to
been.
the next question. So, how does the DMZ fall?
I
Do you
thought the
remember?
DMZ folded because it was sold. If I recall, it was sold to the LCBO and ultimately became an LCBO, which I
Which
think
was
it still
ironic.
is today.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And probably served the goofs well for years to come.
And then Larry's sort of becomes a default place to come back to, but I think it closes soon thereafter.
Yeah, it was,
Do you
and then it
know-
got demolished.
So do you know what happened to how come Larry stopped doing shows? And
No, I don't know I just know that ultimately they just disappear. I mean, the Turning Point just disappears one day, becomes a driving instructor place. You don't, other than the bridge where I knew the guy, I can't remember his name, but I was very tight with the owner. Like he brought me in when they were redesigning the club, and they were designing how the green room for their bands would be. He had me come in during construction and go, "What do you think? Should the club look like this way? How big should the dance floor be?" And I'm like, "I'm just a promoter," but they wanted my opinion. That was about the closest I would have with an actual club. Larry's was just Larry's until it just stopped being, and then it was a shame that it disappeared.
in 1986, a new club comes out. There starts doing shows. It's called The Bridge, and it's called Ildiko's. It has is called Starwood, so it goes through 3 names, but it's the same place.
I don't even know the sequential order of those.
I
always call it The Bridge.
The Starwood first, I think The Bridge second, and Ildiko's third, but it was most commonly known as The Bridge. So there's a show that Hype play on April 26th. How does this place come into existence? How does The Bridge come into existence? Because it becomes one of the most loved places, and probably the place that Hype would come to play most often, I think.
Yeah. I don't remember how it came to be or how I found out about The Bridge, but it's got to be word of mouth somehow, because I found out about it and they were open to doing punk shows, and I went there, I met with them and explained I'm a promoter and whatnot, and we developed a relationship from then forward. And like I said, eventually when they retrofitted, they brought me in to take a look at the club and what they were doing, and as far as design, stage size, that kind of thing. But
I remember seeing Raw Power there first, and
really?
and this was a Jill show, and then I remember seeing DOA,
yeah,
and then DRI and COC. I think I met you at DRI and COC, Derek, and then that was the Starwood. Then it becomes The Bridge, and that's when I started seeing local promoters doing. Like I started seeing Reuben Kincade shows there.
yep.
So I think Jill had broken it in, or maybe someone
Maybe.
else had broken it in.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think there was a few bigger bands from out of town, and then it becomes this.
Yeah, I
Be
think you're right.
interesting
I
to
think it
find
was
out-
Jill.
You're going to talk to Jill or have already?
We will be.
I hope so.
Okay. I hope you do.
I have before
She's already agreed.
many times, but yeah, I'm sure she'll be part of
Because,
this.
you know, if she can recall how she linked into the Starwood, because that would really probably be then
But
how
I wonder if because it was already doing some shows, that's how he would have known about it.
Probably.
Yeah.
I
Okay.
mean, you literally had to jump club to club to club to club. One
Whoever would
opens,
be
one shuts
willing.
down.
Yeah. What would it take to get a punk show in? Because I think like it's not an easy task to convince somebody to do a punk show.
Yeah, unless that's something that they're looking to do, which the Bridge, that was their core thing. They wanted to do that.
Well, a lot of it had to do with, I think anyway, a lot of it had to do with clubs that were on their last legs.
Yeah.
And they were just because if you take a
I'll
look
take
at
anybody.
Yeah, you know, you take a look at the Turning Point. The Turning Point was dead. And then, you know, you had the punks come in. Larry's Hideaway is a little bit of an anomaly because they were a big venue. But the Paramount...
They were still past their prime. Like Larry's Hideaway was, you know, it was a nice hotel at one point, and they actually had fine dining there and all these things. My parents ate dinner there in
Seriously?
the 60s and 70s. They said that they would go there for fancy dinners.
The same is true of Lee's Palace.
Yeah, and by the time, you know, we went to shows there in the 80s, you couldn't, like you had mentioned, you wouldn't even dream of eating something that was cooked at that place.
But, you know, Larry's they were doing one of the first clubs, too, in Toronto that started doing the punk stuff, too, right?
Yep.
And, you know, they always had rock playing there. And, you know, for whatever you thought about the hotel, they still did have a separate business going on top, hourly and whatever you wanted.
Sure.
But, you know, generally speaking, when the punks came to the club, you knew that you could time the life of your business with an egg timer because you were going to be gone soon, whether the club got destroyed, they got evicted, the cops shut it down, or whatever. Yeah. But there was always...
But clearly, Larry's, you know, they probably looked at their business and said, Sundays are the weak spot. Okay, well, punks will show up. You just tell us when and where, and we'll be there. Yeah. So Hardcore Sundays became a staple for them. Yeah. You could never get a Saturday show unless it was a big deal, like maybe Killing Joke or something. But for the rest of us, no, we were there to fill that empty void.
I think I'm probably taking Steve off track here, but you mentioned all these things like breaking in a club, putting out the first record in Toronto, album in Toronto, all these first steps that you and Jill and, you know, very few others really kind of took those bold moves.
Building a promotion alliance.
Building, you know, all these things that you kind of did, you know, before a lot of other people started to do the DIY thing. Starting a record label, all these things.
There's a lot of firsts there.
My thought of you know, hearing this interview, and maybe other people listening to it will think the same, is like, where did that come from? What gave you the right to, you know what I mean? How did you get the confidence? Like, where did that all come from? What was your background that you came into it with that kind of made you think, you know, that you're not intimidated by doing all these firsts? There was no groundwork laid.
Yeah.
So where did that come from?
I really don't know. But
I wonder if it's like, if you're not going to do it, nobody's going to do it.
Nobody's going to do it for you, and you just...
It seems like putting out a record is the next... It seems like a bunch of next steps. Like
it's one step after another. But you don't know how to do them. So then it's, you know, where did you get that confidence from? Because, you know, it's easier for people like myself that came a few years later, and we said, oh, this band put out a record.
There's already somebody who'd done it. It was a blueprint for us to look at.
Yeah,
exactly.
And
we
you
would
can
share
tell
that.
and you can tell us where you got that record done, but... You know, where did you get off doing this?
Yeah, it was just sheer naivety, stupidity, just, you know, gumption. Going, okay, well, clearly there must be a way to do this somehow. And I still remember where it was North Scarborough, wherever it was, the pressing plant, walking in, feeling like, who the hell am I? Why am I here? Like
you feel out of your element
completely, and you got butterflies because I'm some stupid kid walking in or young adult going, I'd like to press a record. What?
Well, that's what I'm kind of getting from this is that, you know, and then going to a club and they're asking you for your opinion on things and you're just thinking like, why are you asking me? What do I, you know, but you came to be known as an expert. It's like you said with Brian, he would be the sort of tastemaker with bands coming and Ben would look to him. Yep. You kind of, I think, became that in the scene a little bit with bringing in bands that we had never heard of and helping a club set up and doing all these things. You kind of became a bit of a tastemaker or the go-to guy. You again, with you and Jill.
I didn't think about it much. I mean, it was just something I enjoyed doing, and it just sort of took a life of its own. I mean, the whole promoting thing, and initially it was just purely to get hype on a stage, for God's sakes. And then from then on, it just kept expanding. We need a record? Okay, well, I'll become a record label. Why wouldn't I? You just keep going, and then you tried. Honest to God, it sounds, you know, trite, but I really wanted to help other bands because we had a tough time starting out. And there were a lot of bands that would come up to you at the show, and they would go, you could tell they were nervous meeting me for whatever stupid reason. And they were like, we've got this band, we'd really like a show if you could ever think about us. And I'd take their name and I go, absolutely, why not? And then you'd phone them, and like I said earlier, they would be shocked that I would be phoning them, and like, oh my God, Reuben Kincade's phoning me. It's like, I'm just me. I'm not a big deal. Like I got a show. You'd be great on it. Let's do it. Let's give you some exposure and go from there.
Well, at risk of sounding silly, we felt a little bit like that when you agreed to do this interview. So that hey, we're tracked you down and we brought you into the studio, and we're happy you're able to do it.
So I want to talk about another one of these first, which is in 1986. There's a show that takes place at the Bridge on Friday, May 2nd, and Countdown Zero, which is a band that you've briefly mentioned, come in from Montreal, and. This is not the first. So, this is not the first that I'm trying to make a point about. On the flyer, this is Derek's mentioned this already, that you had the Canada flag above your name. So this is the first time you start seeing the Canadian flag, which probably had mixed feelings because of people were very anti-nationalist at the time. Like they were thinking, oh, why did you do that? But I think kids from the Toronto scene saw it in a different way, because we were up against a lot of amazing American bands, and this was sort of, in some ways, I think. Well, can you tell? So I want to ask you about putting the Canadian flag on there, because I think it has a purpose, and there's also the Canadian HC logo here, which is one of the first times we start seeing this. We would see it as TOHC, but this is the first time that you start seeing it as Canadian hardcore. So I'm wondering, can you tell us a bit about this Canadiana thing that's going on here? Because it could be viewed the wrong way. I wanted you to explain.
Yeah, it wasn't certainly to be isolationist or anything like that. It was just really about, we are Canadian, and
it could be associated like a skinhead thing, like a nationalist thing, right? So it's not National Front or anything, right?
Oh, never thought of that.
No, so let's put it in context.
Okay, no, it was really about just we were Canadian, and I was Canadian. I'm very proud of Canada. Lots of great bands.
All Canadian lineup here?
Yeah, and I'm a Canadian promoter. We live in a Canadian scene, and America dominated the hardcore scene at the time. There's a lot of, the typical, we got to hear all of this stuff. And I wanted to have Canada sort of stand up in its own little way. So I'm not sure there was a lot more thought put to it other than I was proud of it. I thought, we're Canadian bands.
It's pointing out that there's a scene here and that there's bands exist here, and I think of at the time there's a debate going on. So on the Burn record, "Free Trade" becomes a song. One of the debates about free trade was about the being absorbed culturally by America. But I think lots of people will talk about the difference between Canadian hardcore and American hardcore. I mean, lots of people seem to think that they were the same thing, but from people from Canada, they recognize the distinctions of the differences in sound. And I'm wondering if you could maybe tell us a bit, because I've heard different stories from different punk bands about how Canada was different in terms of punk sounds. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about, I don't think there's a Canadian sound, but what do you think makes Canadian hardcore distinct from American hardcore and from British hardcore? Because those are sort of the two pillars that people recognize, right?
I always thought that the Canadian hardcore sound it was a little unique, and I thought it was because it was a cross blend of the European hardcore and the American hardcore.
This is what I've heard from other people say.
Yeah,
as well.
I remember Ed Ivey and I had a conversation. He was like, "You guys."
Ed Ivey is from the Rhythm Pigs, right?
Yeah, from the Rhythm Pigs. So he was one of the folks in the other bands that talk about the Canadian sound, and we're so immersed in it, we don't really hear it.
Right.
But almost
maybe
like
too close
our
to
accent.
It. Yeah, that's right, right.
So
that we get made fun of.
But Canadian bands had a certain sound to them, not all the same, obviously, but you could kind of tell a Canadian band from an American band, and certainly from a European band, or a UK band in particular. Not because they were singing in English and whatnot, but like a German band, clearly they're from Germany. But I think that it was a blending of the cultures that we had that experience from the Commonwealth. A lot of the UK stuff we embraced, the exploited UK subs, GBH, all Crass or whomever was out there. Whereas I think the Americans really, in some cases, they like the European stuff, but I think they fixated overly on Dead Kennedys, Circle Jerks, the typical MDC, DRI, Corrosion of Conformity, that kind of thing.
Well, I also wonder about lyrically. Like, I think we weren't too shy about criticizing the States, right?
Well,
Being
our
their
whipping boy.
closest. Yeah.
That's how we feel good about ourselves.
I guess so. Yeah. Yeah. So in some ways they become that.
How do you define a Canadian? We're not American. I mean, that's
true.
What's our culture? I'm not them. And it's like, it's an odd thing. I don't know how to explain. If somebody from another country, even within my own business today, says, "Well, what's the difference between Canadians and Americans?" I go, "Because we're not American." I can't tell you the difference. It's just we are who we are. We're evolved from what we are. It's oh boy.
So now we've so I wanted to ask you about a new place that starts emerging in the scene, which is the place called the Latvian House. And can you tell me a bit about where it was and how it came about as a place?
I think that it was on. Oh, it wasn't on Bloor. It was on College.
It's on College.
Okay.
Yeah. It's College in Bathurst.
College in Bathurst. So it was east of Yonge.
West.
West. Okay. It was just a place like a Masonic hall or whatever have you. It was a giant hall that you could rent, and I think I found out about it from Jill. So I think she had maybe done some shows there. Somebody done shows there, and so I got a call from the Brigade, and they were going to be coming up to Toronto, and they wanted to do a show.
An all ages show, probably.
And it had to be. They were very strict about this. It had to be an all ages show. It had to be no liquor whatsoever. It had to be.
So this is keeping in their BYO principles.
Yeah,
yeah.
And they did not want the words Youth Brigade anywhere on there.
So this is when they start changing their name, and they've also changed their sound.
They had just launched an album. They sent me their new album, The Brigade.
They were trying to sound like U2 or somebody.
I listened to it and I was like, oh God, it's not good. I didn't like it.
Nobody did.
And I love Youth Brigade.
And then
sure, everybody liked you.
Not wanting to be having Youth Brigade on the flyer, that kind of puts you in a bad position because that's
no brand recognition.
Yeah, that's the draw, is that people want to see Youth Brigade.
So I took a gamble and I actually put on Youth Brigade on the flyer. They never actually complained about it. They complained about many other things, because that was the only way to connect those two bands. Because the Brigade, who the hell is the Brigade?
Yeah.
And this was a midweek show, if I recall, which was even more brutal.
They had changed their name because they were trying to reflect their sound. They were trying to be honest that they were sort of a different band now, right? In some ways there was some honesty to it, but in other ways it made it very difficult to promote.
Yeah.
And how did that show go?
Not well. So, and at the last minute they insisted that the nils get added because they were friends of
which makes it even more expensive.
Which makes it more expensive. So I already had Hype and Nothing in Particular on the bill. Now you had the nils. I had this massive hall that I had to rent, an entire studio, like a
the sound
system coming in. I had to rent a van to haul the sound system to be in there. There's no booze whatsoever, and nobody shows up. I'd say maybe 100 people. I think No Mind ended up getting thrown on the bill as well. I can't remember, but
also the price of it, $9 at the door, which at the time
shows were
shows were $5 maybe.
Yeah,
so it's almost double the price.
And so there's about 100 people there, and they're literally sitting cross-legged on the floor, and there was no thrashing, there was no action, there was not a lot of kids there at all. A lot of the regulars never showed up, whether it was brand recognition or what have you. And we did not turn enough money at the door, not even close. And so I talked to them. I mean, Hype right away, I said, they're not going to take any money. So I talked to Nothing in Particular. They're like, fine, that's fine, we get it. Then talked to Brigade. I don't even have enough money to pay you based on what I've guaranteed you. Or the nils. I can't even pay the nils. There's no money for them. There's nothing for enough to cover this. And they were really not talking to me about it. They put John Kastner from the Asexuals and put him in front of me as their spokesperson. And they're like, no, they need more money. I go, John, you know how this works. I go, it's the Brigade. There's nothing here. Nobody shows up. What do you want me to do? I only have so much money. Every other band is going to take a massive haircut on this. I'm going to take a haircut on the hall and the sound equipment. I'm giving you everything I physically have. That's it. No, they have to fly to Montreal tomorrow. I go, well, and they need the money for the flight. I said, I've got
when most bands would drive.
I've got a van. You know what? I'll take tomorrow off from work and I'll drive you to Montreal. No, that's not good enough. And so
They come off sounding like prima donnas.
well, Kastner really came off as a jerk that night.
Sure.
And so we were not, luckily Chris Laverton, the drummer for Hype, he had just gotten like a month worth of pay, and he had it all in cash on his person, and he said, "I'll give you the money, Don."
Wow.
But then, so he
wow.
gave,
Wow.
So he gave me every penny he had, and then I gave it to the Brigade, and off they went.
And did that experience, obviously it would sour you to the idea of promoting. It didn't stop you, though.
Well, it made me a lot wiser to making certain commitments. Like, there's no way I would have ever committed to this again. You know, a band that's migrating from one brand to another. The record was not great, and it wasn't really fitting the genre. You're trying to add on extra bands to really take away from the overall pot anyways. It's, all ages. I get it, but it doesn't work.
Was there
a lot of people come out for the beer.
Was there a disillusion with the scene at that point for you?
A little bit.
Well, what seems to me to be this part of the storyline is that these people who generally have good principles have rock star attitudes and just being assholes about this, and all of a sudden sort of forgetting about what it was like to be a punk. And I mean, in some ways, I feel like the Brigade. At this point, the Brigade sort of become a band non grata, if you could say that. Like they were just like, they're not a punk band anymore.
And this was
Why would you go support them?
This is around the same time that the Asexuals started trying to be something else as well.
Yes, I started thinking that leads to the Doughboys and everything else.
Exactly.
That's part of the story, but what I found interesting is that a few months later, there is another show that happened at the Bridge where a bunch of local bands started to come together to support you, to get your back because you lost the money on that show.
So this is the altruism that you talked about, you made reference to, and I find that it's an interest. Can you tell us a bit about that? What happened?
How did it come about?
It's a fundraiser, right?
Yeah, it was just, so the show happened. It was kind of well known that it didn't go well, blah, blah, blah. Then there were other shows happening where I'd be out and walking around, and I'd have other bands coming and going, that's not right. You should do like a fundraiser or something. And I was like, nah. And a couple of local bands kept talking about it, and I was like, okay, well maybe I will. And I said we'll do it. And so I said, okay, let's put on a fundraiser. It was kind of, I felt weird about it because who the hell am I? Why should anybody give a shit that I'm out $1,500 or whatever it was?
It didn't happen often, but I felt like maybe people got what you were doing for the scene,
exactly,
and didn't want to see you hurt by it for taking the chance.
And as one of the bands that were on the bill, I was in MSI at the time we played on that show. I mean, we saw an appreciation for what you had done for the scene, and we wanted that to continue, right? And so it would make sense to support that, and by the bands that were on the bill supporting you, that allows you to then to put on more shows. So, which then we can also play on and see these bands and all of these things. We wanted that scene to continue, right?
Yeah, I know. I do remember it was really uncomfortable for me because I just
I could see that
it didn't.
But the flyer actually has a number of really interesting things in it. So this is the show that takes place on Saturday, February 28th. It's at the Bridge, and the Hardcore Hotline is on here. Mm-hmm. But more importantly is this graphic.
I love that graphic.
This is one of my favorite graphics of all time from this period. Can you describe this graphic?
Sure. So there's that famous picture of the U.S. Marines that was mocked up on Iwo Jima, where I guess they just taken the island, and so they were raising the American flag, and they've got these Marines pushing it up. And there was a kid, I shouldn't call him a kid, but a fan called Todd Stong, and his name's here in the corner. He used to come out to shows and whatnot, and he would do art, and he would show me this stuff. And he says, "Can I do, if I do some art for Hype, do you think you could use it on a poster or whatnot?" And I said, "Yeah, absolutely." I mean, and I ended up using it multiple times.
Yeah.
I said, "Yeah, absolutely. So, send me some stuff." And I remember he was out in Pickering or somewhere, or maybe Oshawa or something. Anyways, he sent me the artwork, and I said I loved it, and he was so
that's amazing.
He was so stoked that I put it on a poster, and even more flabbergasted when we put it on the second album as the sort of the backing artwork underneath the lyrics for the Burned album. So he was just blown away. I can't remember if we sent him any money for that, but that was I was just one of those.
I just wanted to recognize who he was and,
Yeah,
and
he
how
was-
you met him. So.
He was there was a lot of people out there that had a lot of skills in certain things, and they were just so appreciative if they'd give it to you and you'd use it, and they'd be like, that's huge recognition for them.
One of the things I feel that the Toronto hardcore scene is about offering opportunities for people to.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and this is one of those examples of somebody just approaching you, and it seems very approachable, right? Like the punk kids would just come up to you and show you something. Okay, so let me get into. Let's see. Do I want to talk about this show? I want to talk about the Rhythm Pigs. You mentioned Ed Ivy already.
Love those guys.
Tell me about who the Rhythm Pigs were, because I think you put them on quite a few times, and this is the example. So there's a show here in 1987. It takes place at the Bridge. It's Friday, August 14th, and it's a Reuben Kincade and Dayglo Productions. This is one of the first times that I see. I mean, we always knew that you guys worked together, sort of. You know, like, I mean, you would talk together.
Yep.
But this is the first time we see sort of an official working together, at least on paper.
I mean, I don't remember the exact how this all came to be. This could have been the first time the Rhythm Pigs came to Toronto. I don't know.
No, this isn't the first time.
But if Jill was involved,
they played the DMZ the first time.
Oh, did they? Okay.
So it would have been 85 that they first came here.
Because this was, in all likelihood, because I know I did this show, they probably contacted Jill. Jill contacted me, said I can't do it. And so we kind of I took it over and did a cross thing. Because that wasn't very often, but every once in a while, she would shoot stuff over to me. That's probably how this came about. And Rhythm Pigs were a 3-piece out of El Paso, Texas. Sort of had I don't even know how you describe their music.
I don't know either. I mean, I can take attempts, but
a southwestern,
more interested in your
twangy, hardcore, jazzy. I mean, it just throw every adjective in there. They were such an
but they weren't
innovative
gutless. They had a lot of guts.
Oh yeah, and they were just great guys. And again, they stayed with us at the Hype House.
They took issue with MR. They had a back and forth against MR. There's different things that they took on some of the punk pillars, right?
Yep.
Anyway,
they were great guys. We got along with them really well. And then, I mean, I know you talked to Ed, so maybe he's told you a story. But so they're in town. We did a show, and they're like, "Is there anything else?" And so I think that was a Friday night show, or maybe this was it. And they go, "Would anything going on Saturday?" There was nothing going on Saturday, so I phoned the promoter in Ottawa. I said, "You got anything going on in Ottawa?" She goes, "Yeah, I've got a show tomorrow night." I said, "I got the Rhythm Pigs sitting here. Can I bring him up and put him on the bill?" And she goes, "Absolutely." So immediately she starts, letting everybody know the Rhythm Pigs are coming. And then the Rhythm Pigs are like, "Oh, Don, you're coming with us. You're our tour manager now."
Oh, yeah.
Oh, so then you got promoted to tour manager. That's another.
So I'm kind of sitting there going, I guess I got nothing better to do. So off into their van, and we went up to Ottawa and did the show up in Ottawa.
Melanie Kay?
Yes.
Yeah.
I totally forgot her name. Yeah, she was a really nice lady.
Still is. She works, I think, doing stuff. She's still in the punk promotion.
Oh, okay.
She'll be working on the book with us, too.
Oh, excellent.
We're going to be talking to her.
Yeah.
Yep.
I don't know. Again, I don't know if I'm taking Steve off course
No,
here,
please,
but
no,
the Rhythm Pigs, so you developed this relationship with them. There's another flyer that I saw that I mentioned to you. I don't know if you know or you remember the story behind it, but it was kind of a weird situation. I don't really understand what was happening there, but somebody else kind of almost looked like they hijacked the show from you. They were
PM
saying
Promotions, I think.
PM Promotions. Do you know anything about this?
No.
We'll have to show you
Because
that.
I know I promoted them twice and put on their shows twice in Toronto.
The strange part was that they put out a flyer that said something like, basically they're accusing you of not giving the show enough promotion, so they were kind of promoting it on the Rhythm Pigs' behalf. It was the weirdest.
Seriously.
I've never seen anything like that before. And also, knowing you and how you operated, you were obviously really good at promoting these shows. So it just seemed very out of character. And I was wondering who that PM Promotions was and what they were up to.
I don't know.
Yeah.
So it also begs the question about the first MSI show, which takes place. It was an S.N.F.U. show, also at the Latvian House. It took place in 1986. So I'm digressing a bit. We're going back. Wednesday, December 3rd was the date, and initially it was being promoted as a Reuben Kincade show. Then becomes a favorite Stooge Productions, which is Al Ridley, who this is his first show that he ever did, and there's a lot of significant things about the show because this is the first time that S.N.F.U, this is their second record, has just come out, and they actually pick it up at the pressing plant out in Mississauga on the way to this show. We become the first audience that gets copies of If You Swear You'll Get No Fish, which is recorded in the Chris Walter book on S.N.F.U. And so we're the first audience to ever listen to this second record, also being performed. I remember it being a fantastic show. MSI is their first show. There's a lot of firsts that happen at the show, but do you know what happened? Because originally it was your show and then it becomes Al's show.
Well, the weird thing about it too, like not only was it was billed, there's a flyer that exists that says it's your show, and Hype was an opening band, and then what actually happened was Al did the show and Hype was replaced by us, MSI, and I also have a copy of the receipt that Al rented the hall. So it took place early on where Al totally took over the show and was responsible for renting the hall and all of that. So just curious, like
Al mentioned to me that you had to step out of town and you couldn't do it. So
But
you see this
because I saw one.
What I find remarkable about this is that. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I saw the poster because when you first asked me about S.N.F.U. and the Hype playing in Toronto, I went, Hype never played with S.N.F.U. in Toronto. I know we played with them in Regina. I know we played with them in Montreal. But I knew dead certain we'd never played with them in Toronto. And so when I saw the poster, I go, that's my poster. I mean, I know my work. That I did that. So how it got transferred to Al, there must have been some reason why Hype and myself had to back out. Because even if Hype, like let's say Chris burnt his hand or somebody was injured in the band or something and they couldn't play, I would have still promoted the show. I mean, certainly with S.N.F.U., but there had to be, and I can't think of a reason because December, we don't tour in December. We tour in the summer. So I don't know what it was about December that I would have had to relinquish the show.
What I see is a collaborative spirit amongst promoters. I see nowadays, like in more contemporary times, or at least like in more recent periods, I've seen competitive spirits amongst punk promoters trying to outbid each other for shows. But back then in the day, you saw people trying to make things work. Can you talk to me about that? Because I see I look at it as a distinct difference in the periods. And speaking to the altruism, I mean, we speak of the altruism, and it has many different examples. This is just another one of them. But, it looks like people were willing to help people out in a bind to make something work so that people didn't get caught so that bands didn't get caught in a bind. Yeah. Like, I feel like, can you speak to that?
I don't think there was an air of competition between the promoters. I mean, if people were doing shows, it was okay, fine. I mean, there were a lot of bands to go around. So, and then, like I mentioned, Jill and I, we'd see each other sometimes at the clubs and we'd spend some time talking about promoting but it was never about, you stole this act or stole that act. It just never came up. I can only handle so many bands.
Well, so, I was going to say, too, is that there seemed to be a plethora of bands to book.
Yes.
Especially during that Ildico's Bridge, that 86, 87 time period. If you look at the timeline, there are bands, out-of-town bands playing here 2-3 nights a week for 2 years straight. It just seems like the heyday of hardcore in Toronto, especially for touring bands. And that would be with most of the shows were you and Jill, but then other people like, Al Ridley got involved, Sean McDonald put on some shows. And as Steve kind of pointed out, it did seem like there was no real competition. It seemed like there's so many bands. And like you said, maybe you needed 4-5 promoters in the city to handle it all.
And I think a lot of that was the word of mouth and the reputation that Toronto was getting south of the border, because bands would come up, they'd take a chance, they'd tour Toronto, because,
crossing the border.
Prior to that, you'd only get the really big bands coming up because they had the wherewithal to do it, and Jill would make sure all the paperwork was done legally to get them across the border, and then they would go back. But now you had bands like Rhythm Pigs or whoever, Vampire Lesbos, pick a band. They would go back and they would interact with other bands in other cities as they toured, and they would talk about, we were up in Toronto, and they're going, you actually crossed the border in another country? What's that like? Oh, it was great. The scene was really great there. We got paid fair. It was a great show.
The word would get out. Yeah.
The word gets around. I mean, these touring bands, they click together because they have to. Everything is about the internet. If it existed, hardcore would have been amazingly efficient. Back then, it was all word of mouth, and Maximum Rock and Roll, Seed Reports. Who do I trust? Who don't I trust? Who's been there? Who hasn't? And I think more and more bands started coming to Toronto and going, you're coming through. This is a big market to hit. So it's Montreal. And if you can guarantee shows in London, Ottawa, it's worth your while now to cross the border. So you got these second tier, which to us are still phenomenal bands, making the effort to come across the border.
Now, you mentioned Jill doing it legit and filling out the paperwork. Did you go that route as well, or did you try and sneak people over, or combination?
I did it a couple of times where she actually, we sat down, I can't remember what club it was at, and she spent like an hour and a half with me explaining how to get, where do you go, where do you get the paperwork, all the work visas, all that kind of stuff. Did that a couple of times. More often than not, the bands would just sail across the border, and
I'll take
it's
our
not a
chances.
problem. Yeah. Or they were entering somewhere else in the country, and it was not my problem. So they were coming into Vancouver or Montreal,
Right,
whatever.
and then traveling across.
Yep.
Okay, I wanted to ask you about this partnership with the Rhythm Pigs, did it lead into doing other tours in the States? Like, did Hype ever start? So around 1987, Hype do a second tour. Do they go to the States, or do
No.
they stay in Canada?
No, we stayed in Canada.
So then, what are your observations of the Canadian scene the second time around? Do you see some development going on, and in what ways? Like, do you see some nasty things happening? Do you see some good things happening?
No,
What are your observations about the Canadian scene across
Excluding Winnipeg, it was all great.
Poor Winnipeg.
Winnipeg gets beat up on.
Yeah,
But
like I said, third tour of Winnipeg was great, but the second tour, you saw the scenes getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and there were more.
so lots of growth then.
Yeah, and there was now, like the first tour, you didn't have sort of the secondary cities that you hit, like Sault Ste. Marie and Kelowna. Kelowna was fantastic. You need those way stations along the way between, like, Calgary to Vancouver is a hell of a drive.
Yeah, it's a big.
So to stop in Kelowna and have a great show, and we ended up playing we met Pig Farm in Kelowna and played with them. It's like we just sort of
Band
happened
from here.
Yeah, we never even heard of them before, and we're like, hey, how you doing? We're from Toronto. We're playing together. Okay.
Yeah, and then some of the members were in L'Étranger, which
Yeah.
is like our version of the Clash. So
Yep.
you had a reason to know each other.
Yeah.
What-
So the scenes were getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Regina was always fantastic. Like I said, Regina was great. Vancouver was great. They were all growing and getting better, and the community radio stations were really involved. So we would do radio interviews at the local call stations while we were out there. It got much more coordinated. The promoters were a lot better. It was a growing scene.
So that's nationally. With regards to Toronto specifically, like, we're working on a book that is about Toronto hardcore.
Yep.
And, you were obviously involved pretty early in the scene. And I'm assuming it sounds like you even maybe went to some shows in the 70s, late 70s. Like, did you go to see the Clash and that
Yeah.
kind of, you know what I mean? So you kind of got a sense of that. You probably saw some of the bands at the concert hall, the Dead Kennedys or whatever.
I missed the Kennedys. That would have been a good one.
Well, so I'm just kind of curious, like, at least you got to the turning point and some of that. What's your take on the Toronto scene kind of changing over time? You've kind of gotten into some of the things that made it special, where you're talking about the Circle Pit a little bit later on. You're talking about unity between, like, race wasn't a thing. Sexism wasn't really as much of a thing as other scenes. As it kind of, the scene kept evolving into the, mid, like, say 87, the Bridge period, Ildikos, that kind of thing, and later getting into the Silver Dollar, the Apocalypse Act. Did you notice a change from that earlier period at the turning point to the later period of the 80s?
I think the biggest things I noticed was, it grew in size dramatically. I don't know what a Young Lions show was. I never went, so I don't know how big they were. But I noticed that the shows getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Even the local shows. Yeah, you'd have the odd one where the attendance was a little bit off. But when you're getting local shows where I can tell you from the gate stuff, and a lot of people get in for free because they don't have the money or they can only afford a beer. But I need to make sure the bar gets paid, they're making some money, and that the band has somebody to play to. So when you tally up the end result, there were nights where we had some all local shows where there were minimum 400 people in there plus. It might look like 250 or something, but the money doesn't lie. There was over 400 people in those shows. That's amazing for a local show, for local bands, or whether it was Sudden Impacts, whoever was playing. You had a lot of people coming out to see it. It was a really vibrant. It was fun, and I saw over time it became less of the old leather jacket, mohawk, that the original London UK punk style thing, and it became wear whatever you want. It doesn't matter. And people got along, and started to be celebrities in the scene. I mean, if Kenny Huff and Anthony showed up, it was like a big deal. Or you saw Milo in the crowd, it was like, hey, there's Milo from Sudden Impact.
You're going to my next thing, is that were there people that stuck out? And
Sure.
there are for everybody, but from your position, who stuck out and why did they make an impact?
I mean, certainly Ken and Anthony, because they drove the pit. And, sometimes they might have gone a little too far. They were rolling over tables and whatnot, but they were iconic to the scene.
In some ways, they would help police the scene too.
That was what I was going to say, is that there wasn't really security at these shows so much, and I think that it was self-policing, and I think they were two of the biggest bodyguards that were. Yeah,
and there didn't need to be most of the time. I mean, the only time there was ever trouble.
Their approach was not like a bouncer. It was very different. They were actually more interested in getting in that pit than they were keeping people from fighting, but you knew that if there was a fight that broke out, you had to stand up against one of these guys.
Yeah,
and
it was gonna be
nobody was interested in doing that, right?
Yep.
So it was a different model of like getting along.
Yep.
In some ways, right? Not one I've ever seen replicated since, and not one I've seen before.
And as a promoter, I imagine you would have appreciated that, having a couple guys that were going to take care of that wasn't going to be a problem for you.
Yeah, you wouldn't have to worry about security or muscle or people not getting it, because security guards wouldn't get it, and so they just
we never had security, but you had people that you knew you could count on to have your back. So when I worked at Door, I knew I had people that had my back if something went south, and very Canadian, it almost never did. Outside of, I remember one time where there was a girl there that pitted her boyfriend against some other guy, and the stupid, male mentality. I got to fight because my girlfriend's put me in this spot. That was just stupid. And there was one time somebody was getting the crap beat out of them on Bloor Street outside of the bridge, and I ran down, and I don't know if Kenny was with me or not, but ran down, and there were these guys, really had nothing to do with the show, but they were like laying out beating on this guy. And you go to break it up, and the one guy sort of opens up a jacket, pulls out a gun, and you're like, okay, I'm done. That was the only time I ever saw anything like that.
Yeah. But it was rare.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was.
Whereas in Detroit,
oh my God,
I would think Detroit, we would see guns at shows.
Well,
and
it
stuff,
sounds rare, but also sounds unrelated to the show. Sounds like you're saying it wasn't the
Well, Bloor Street was a really hopping place, right?
Yeah.
Especially when the bridge would empty.
But it wasn't the punk kids causing the trouble.
No.
It was them kind of sorting out the trouble.
No.
So
Which W5 wouldn't have you believe.
The cops would come into the bridge. They knew what was going on in there. They didn't really care. They would come in, and they would go to the bridge. At one point had a little restaurant in the back there, sort of the front of the club, or at the very back of the club. They would come in and they'd get a free coffee and a sandwich or whatever and walk out, and that was their little payoff for not bothering the show. They didn't care. I mean, the cops knew what was going on in there. It was contained, it was organized, it wasn't causing any problems. The police came in, they'd lean on them a little bit, get their free thing, and they'd leave. And that was about it.
I was going to say, did they ever ask for payola?
Not for me.
So I want to ask you about, we've sort of talked a bit about, we've done some summations here, but I think prematurely, because I want to ask you a bit about some of the tragedy that Hype endured, because Hype didn't have a smooth ride the whole time, and even though we're making it seem like everything's great and everything like that, and as a manager, this would be some difficult times that you would have to try and help them out of. So, and that becomes, we've talked a bit about the Burned album already, but can you tell me about where the name comes from, because it has a story?
Well, the name originally was a name of a song, and it's about being burned, working for a company for a long time and then getting outsourced or laid off or whatever.
But it has a double entendre.
And then it has a double entendre. In fact, we have a song in here called Life is Harder Than You Die, which we were planning on the third album.
Yeah.
We were going to take Burned and make that the name of the third album.
Oh, is that right?
So there was a leaping factor, but when the place burned down...
So there was enough material that you were writing a third album for Hype?
There was about, 4 or 5 songs that were created under the last bastion of the old Hype and the new group, like Dave Cornelius and Steve. So there was some songs that were created at the tail end of the second generation of Hype and some of the third. But we always intended to do a third album, and we thought, let's do this stupid thing where we have a song that skips and becomes the...
Because I wondered about that, yeah.
Yeah, it becomes the next idol doesn't even have that song on it, but it's the title of the album, but it's a song from the second. It was just, that's the way Hype thought. It was like stupid things.
Well,
when it burned down.
S.N.F.U. had every title had to have 7 words in it. Right?
Oh, really?
Yeah. So I also think that's interesting about Canadian bands. They had some things. There's things about different Canadian bands.
Quirky.
There's just this quirkiness to them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know. Anyway, but tell me about the story Burned.
Okay, so
Well, I'm interested to know if there's other material out there that hasn't been recorded or it hasn't been released.
there is.
That's
and
why I was asking
I wish I
you.
could find it.
There is stuff.
There was a group of songs that we were playing live on the third tour that I thought was some of the best stuff that Hype had ever done.
Right.
There was this one song in particular called "What War Is This?" and
They're live recordings or are they studio recordings? Is there demos of them?
I would love to find one. I know it was taped off the soundboard in Vancouver.
Okay.
And we had it in the van and we were listening to it. I don't know what happened to it. It's gone. I wish, because I love that song. I thought it was one of the best things Hype ever did. And I would be sitting at the back of the show. I mean, we were on tour, so my job at that point is sit at the back, sell T-shirts and stickers and
Do the
albums
merch,
and stuff. And I would be like waiting the whole set, going, wait till I hear this song, because it was like tear the paint off the walls, balls to the walls. It was such a great song, and it was just such a shame that it never got recorded officially. That we could have done something with it, because it's one of those. Now it's gone. It's faded away into history. So.
Okay, well, tell us about
Okay.
Burn. Where does the name? Because it has a secondary
Yeah.
meaning, right? Tell us about the secondary meaning, which is the one that actually.
Yeah, the
affects
secondary meaning is when the second Hype house burned down. So we were all, the majority of the band and our friends, we were all over at the 5 Drive-In, this drive-in movie theater in Oakville. And we come back.
It's famous. I love going there.
Oh, yeah.
It's my favorite place
the
to go
last
see.
one in, I don't know, forever.
Yeah.
It's still there. And we all come back from the drive-in, and there's fire trucks and police, and we're like, what the hell's going on? And then we see smoke just pouring out of our place, and then we realize, oh, it's our place that's on fire. And so people are yelling at us. The neighbors, they know it's us. They're angry because we've caused this. We weren't even in here. We were at the 5 Drive-In. But Jerry, the bass player, my brother, was at home, and so.
Did you get suspected of arson? Was there some accusations going on?
Yeah, there was they checked by the fire department to find out what the cause was. The band did end up getting sued by the building for, I can't remember, $80,000. So yeah.
How did you get it? Did you prove innocence? Or?
Yeah, my parents helped us out. We hired a lawyer. And the band ended up in litigation with the place, and there was no proof from the fire department that we had anything to do with it. And it looked like an electrical wiring issue, and that was the official cause of the fire.
Which would have been a landlord, yes.
Right. So we got out from under that, thank God.
Yeah.
Sure. Because that would have crippled us.
Well, that's a good thing. I was thinking, how many benefit shows would we have to have done to
no kidding.
pay off $80,000?
But at that time, it feels like a crippling thing because you do lose a lot of stuff. What happens to the band?
Yeah, we lost.
What did you lose in the
everything.
fire?
You literally had nothing but the clothes that you wore to the drive-in movie. So I had nothing. Everything was gone. So the cover of the Burned album is a picture of the actual inside of our house, and that's Jerry's bass guitar. I think it's a Rickenbacker or something, or maybe it was.
Which looks really charred.
Yeah, and it's completely charred. So
unplayable.
Yeah, we lost T-shirts, albums, all of our personal effects. The guitars, everything was gone. So
can I ask you, had this record been recorded? Because I had also heard something about tapes being burned, and I'd wondered if this had to be re-recorded.
No masters were destroyed. None of the. I still have the original artwork for both. Actually, I gave them to Jerry to safekeep for me. I still have.
Was there a different piece of artwork
for this?
Yeah, for burned.
No.
Okay.
No, this became the artwork. So the album was already either in the works or it was contemplated or whatnot, and maybe Fringe came along later. But somehow this seemed right to make it Burned. This became the album cover, picture of Jerry's bass.
So how did you get back equipment? How did you become a band again? Because after something like this, generally,
we were.
This would be something that a band would break up over.
Yeah.
Right. So
yeah. So we lost the bass. Sheen's guitar was fine. John didn't live with us, so his guitar was fine. The drums were not there.
So half your equipment was.
Yeah. So a lot of the stuff was actually saved, and it was all sitting in Brian's basement in the rehearsal studio. So Jared just had to have his bass there. There was a few other things that we lost musically, but nothing that would cripple the band.
Can you tell us a story about Jerry being rescued?
Okay, so
he was in the house at the time,
he
right?
was in the house.
He almost died.
He was just he almost.
I shouldn't laugh because
not to put it lightly, he almost died.
I shouldn't laugh because
this is like a hype thing. I mean, then Dave dies in a house fire.
He does, yes.
I mean, what the hell's going on here?
Yeah, there seems to be some parallelisms with the hype story, right? Which are very serious and not laughing matters.
Yep.
So we've already mentioned Dave passing from a fire.
Yep. So we get there and we're told, somebody says, your brother's at the back of the facility of the building. So we walk around the back and we look up and we see Jerry standing there. He's got no clothes on. He's buck naked. All he has wrapped around him is a rebel flag, like a Confederate
Why
flag.
does he have no clothes on?
Because he was asleep when this happened. And and this is honest to God's truth, he woke up and in his room we had this military camouflage netting. Like the place was decked out like, it was just decked out like a punk place would be. Right?
Yeah.
So we had this camouflage netting all along the roof, and it started melting. So the fire wasn't in his room, but his room got so hot that the camouflage netting started melting and landing on him.
Oh.
And he woke up, and the entire room, he couldn't see anything, but he was lucky the balcony was off his room, so he managed to stumble his way to the balcony. He managed to grab his cigarettes, of course, on the way. And he's out there on the balcony waiting for the firemen to...
You realize what your priorities are.
He's waiting to be
Forget
rescued.
clothes.
He's waiting to get rescued, standing there with a Confederate flag around his waist, having a cigarette while there's a fire going on behind him.
He managed to grab a Confederate flag to cover himself.
Yeah.
I guess that was the easiest thing to grab.
So, and we're just going, the hell did you do? And he goes, I didn't do anything. I was asleep. And... You know, he looked like Al Jolson. He was completely black, and
oh wow!
It was, but yeah, it was funny at the time.
He had no burns or anything.
No, he was okay,
lucky.
and
that's good.
But like it set us back personally, but as a band, it we just sort of overcame it.
It's kind of one of those things.
He bought a new bass guitar, and we moved on.
I thought there might have been a benefit though for either to raise money or to help you with your equipment, because I remember this picture being taken. So there's a picture that appears in the liner notes of Burned, and it's a thank you to the kids in the Toronto hardcore scene, and you see a bunch of people jumping in. And a lot of my friends are here. A lot of that's my brother, by the way.
That's a great idea.
I think it's an amazing idea too, and I wish more people would do it or like learn about this idea to steal it. And because I thought it was sort of a thank you to everybody for coming to this fundraising show or this benefit show. But it also was sort of like a symbolic, this is the Toronto scene shot, right?
Yeah.
So it's a couple of things. It's like almost like a yearbook shot of the scene at the time, and a thank you to the scene for the fundraiser and stuff. I thought it was a couple of things. So it doesn't say that in the notes, but I thought I remembered that, and I'm asking you if you recall that or not.
As I recall, this seems to be when we did the video shoot in the bridge that day as well. So we went in earlier, did the video shoot, and then we paused the show mid show and took a picture of the crowd. And of course, when the crowd knows their picture's going to get taken,
they ham it up.
Oh, I mean,
they're all
Toronto looks like the most rocking place on the planet.
Yeah.
I mean, I see there's John's old girlfriend, there's Gidget. I can't remember this guy's name, but he was a staple at the show, all the shows. That looks like the old.
We don't have enough of these
game.
shots. So.
Yeah, so it was a great shot. We thought this is a really good shot of the Toronto scene. Let's put it on our album as a way of saying
was it John who took the shot? I think
he might have.
I think he did. He's like, everyone get in front.
Yeah.
Anyway, I think it was
just a great way to get the scene back in. And of course, it wasn't designed this way, but in retrospect, it's a great way to get people to buy the album.
Sure, because they want to see themselves. Yeah.
Why
totally.
wouldn't you?
Yeah. But I don't think you went into it with that marketing.
No.
That's
we were not that savvy.
Also, it was on the inside of the album, so they wouldn't actually know. So
unless you
also really bad planning if that was the...
1988, we start seeing a new club coming about. It's the Silver Dollar. Can you tell me about where that is?
It's on Spadina. Yeah, it is on Spadina. Okay, so...
it's kind of close to the Latvian house. It's Spadina in College.
Yeah.
It's along that same corridor, I
It's
think.
just up from El Macombo.
So it's I think of like the bridge being sort of like a Bathurst and Bloor,
Yeah.
and then Latvian House being a college in Bloor, and I think see this at Spadina and College, and it's sort of like it's all kind of near the market, Kensington Market.
DMZ was there, Quoc-Tay.
It seems like the West End.
Hall.
Yep.
Yeah, this place, the Ukrainian Hall, which is where the DRI Dr. No show happens. It seems to be a place where lots of punks. This is for at least 5 or 6 years, definitely punk central in some ways, right? But what was the Silver Dollar before? Do you know, or do you know how the show started happening at the Silver Dollar?
It was all wasn't it always a $Silver Dollar?
I think it was. Yeah, they had
doing-
that huge.
It used to do like big bands used to come in there, like big names, and do surprise shows, like almost like the El Macombo. That was my thought. I don't know who broke it open.
It was right there. It was right beside the.
Yeah, I don't know
really
who
close.
broke it open to do the first show. Again, who knows? Maybe it was Al, maybe it was Jill. Somebody did. Somebody figured out the Silver Dollar was open for business.
Might have been Elliot Lefko, actually. I see a bunch of his flyers
Yeah.
pretty early on. That's where he did a few things, I think, at the bridge, right at the tail end of the bridge, and then the first flyers I've seen seem to be his stuff at the Silver Dollar. So I think
think so,
maybe
yeah.
I think maybe that was where he's the one that found
He was
that
doing
place.
the Symphony as well.
And this is one of those reciprocal shows I was talking about. So Death Sentence, who's a Vancouver, one of the biggest bands in Vancouver, they opened for Hype in Vancouver, and Desperate Minds they opened up for us in Kelowna, I think. And so both of them happened to be on tour, not together, and they both happened to be hitting Toronto at the same time. So I said, "Yep, we'll look after you."
Yeah, Desperate Minds were a young band at the time,
Yeah.
and I remember them being very BYO-esque and feeling. They were young
Yeah.
kids, but they certainly had that feel of a BYO band, even though they weren't on BYO.
Yeah.
But it made it feel like it was the right
I
fit.
was friends with them, and they were trying to get me to book the show, and I gave it to Don instead.
Oh, did
There's
you?
no way I was going to do it. Yeah.
And Sound by Neil, I also wanted to say. So
was
Neil
probably-
makes a return.
Yeah, he was in town for whatever reason, and I went, "Hey, you want to do a show for me?" And it's like Sound by Neil, like people are going to come.
I was gonna say he got billing. That's pretty impressive for a sound man.
Whoa, wait a minute!
If Neil's there,
I got 2 shows. I'm going to go to the one with Neil.
if Neil's there, I'm in. Count me
Neil
in.
was kind of this.
It feels like, just like part of the Hype team, kind of
Yeah,
like the
he was
Hype group
he was
a
our
little.
goofy friend we used to hack on constantly. But he turned out to be a going concern in the end. So
And then later on in the year, we see a band with a show with
Psycho,
Psycho.
and
So they were from Boston. I figured
Another
that
Boston band.
I was thinking that was the Boston connection.
Yeah.
Alternative Inuit. Who were they?
they were a band that opened up for us in Montreal on one of our shows. So they're just I don't remember them in any detail. They were just another Montreal band that was on one of the shows, and KOK would have been a local band here.
And then this is the last flyer that I have, which is in 1988, and it's at the Masonic Temple in Oakville, which made me think maybe this was the earlier show and not a later show. But Brute Creation are on it, and they were a later period band. So
No, we did another one in not at the same place that we did the Stretch Marks show in Oakville, but yeah, we did another all ages big hall show in Oakville.
it made me think that it's sort of like a returning of the root to the roots, and maybe like this is like trying to like this is a band from here kind of
Yeah,
thing.
this is probably one of the the creation of Hype and Negative Gain in one of our Harvey's strategy meetings.
Yeah.
It was we got this scene. It's let's bring some back to Oakville. So
You go on a third tour. The Life is Hard and Then You Die record has, I think, can you tell me a bit about the distribution? You mentioned that Fringe did some here, but there's also like a European connection with We Bite Records. Can you tell me a bit about that?
Yeah, we were contacted by We Bite Records, which is a record label out of Germany. At first, they contacted us. They wanted to be the distributor through Europe for Life is Hard. So we distributed all the records through them. And then they said we were...
Did you only do 1,000 press?
Oh, no, there were more than that.
So there's more. Okay.
There were multiple pressings.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's good to know.
But it's you couldn't press like 5,000-10,000 all
No.
at one time.
No.
So every time you'd run out, you'd gather up enough money either through hype shows or whatever, and then you'd go and have another pressing made, which was a lot cheaper than because you now had the
Did you do it 2 or 3 times? Do you recall?
I think
how
we
many
did
times?
like 4 or 5 times.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I didn't know there was that many.
And then we stopped because we had enough for North America, and then We Bite said, "I'd like the exclusive license for Europe, and we'll press the record in Europe
Oh,
on WeBite.
even
And
better.
So they took over and they started pressing their record there, different colored vinyl, a few little subtle differences, and then they also did Burn. So that was part of the negotiation with Ben Hoffman with Fringe. I said, I can't give you Europe. I can only give you North America because I'm already in a deal with WeBite. So WeBite took care of Hype in Europe, and Fringe took care of us in North America.
So you do a third tour, and with this, now you've got European distribution. You start thinking, I mean, I would start thinking that would Hype go to Europe. So tell me about the third tour first. Where did you go? Was it also in Canada?
Yes.
So
all
you never
Canada.
you never went to the States?
No.
Although you put on all these bands and we're sort of building to go to the States, you never
Yeah.
went to the States. What
What
happens on the third tour?
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, to go into the United States, that would be to just make a short jaunt. Like I know Direct Action did it, but that's kind of a short strategic strike. It's hard to make enough money along the way to justify it, and you're really not going to hit a lot of scenes anyways. We would constantly go to Montreal or Ottawa and little short jaunts outside of the tours.
So the only way you could have seen Hype is to come to Canada.
Yeah. So you
make it a unique
We weren't
thing.
at a point where the band was big enough or making enough money that everybody was going to shed their jobs. It just wasn't going to happen. So even though we were planning a Europe, and that was going to mean we were going to take big time off from work, but that was worth it. So we didn't do the U.S. boat. So a third tour, another tour across Canada. This one we had really sown our road, so we were getting major play across the country, doing all the radio stations, all the campuses and whatnot, all the fanzines. It was like a traditional if Circle Jerks came through or something. So we were getting that kind of treatment. And at that point, the band had changed. So Jerry and Sheen had left. Chris had already long since been gone. So now we had Dave Cornelius, ex-Direct Action, and Steve, I can't remember his last name, that's terrible, but I can't remember, he's from Decimation. He actually joined when Rob Mallion from Youth, who was rehearsing with Hype, decided he didn't want to stay with the whole hardcore thing. So at one point, it was looking like we were going to have a rockin' thing with ex-Direct Action, ex-Hype, ex-Youth.
Like the first wave of the hardcore scene.
Yeah, and I remember seeing a fanzine, like
Would've
the
been an
first
all-star
super
lineup.
group.
Yeah.
And it's like, man, it's kind of a weird thing to say, but Rob was phenomenal, and he was such a songwriter for Youth that he was going to be a great addition to the band, but
for sure.
it just wasn't what he wanted to do. So Steve joined, and so we went across the country in his giant cube van, basically living room on wheels, and we had a great time. We made tons of money. We could stay in hotels. At that point we were doing extremely well, so we weren't living hand to mouth anymore. So.
Why don't we talk about that van for a while? Because I remember that van. You guys really had that all tricked out. You disconnected the odometer.
You remember that?
I remember disconnecting the odometer, and I remember you had a spot in the back for all your equipment. Like it was like a U-Haul type of cube van, not from U-Haul, but it was a U-Haul type of cube van. And then you guys actually built an apartment.
Yes.
In it.
Yeah, so on the first van, the first tour, we had this regular van, and you dump all the equipment in the back. Every time you hit the brakes, you had a wall of equipment coming to crush you, and it was small. It was the most horrendous experience. Outside of playing, being in that van was terrible. But so then we moved to a cube van, and which is like a 27-foot truck with a giant box on the back. And so Jerry, who's Mr. Handyman, would build this giant wooden box at the back. And so you'd load the equipment from the back. It would all be within the confines of this box. All the T-shirts, the albums, everything would go back there. On the top was padding and a bed. So you could have a couple of people sleeping on top of that. And the back door of the van, which is like a roll-up garage door type of thing, he had it rigged where the top flap could flap down. So you just unrelease this hinge, and it would come down. You could literally lie there while we were driving, looking out the back, and watching, the traffic go by or whatever, just have a nap, but you wouldn't actually fly out the back.
So in the stories of Rollins, like some of the Rollins stories, you hear of him like staying in the back of cube vans while Black Flag was touring because he'd had enough of hanging out with them and he just wanted to be alone. Extremely illegal, right?
Oh yes,
it wasn't legal. I don't think
totally illegal. We had a couch in there. We had
but more comfortable for sure.
Oh yeah, it was like because being trapped in a van and going, 8-hour drives
Would make you crazy. It would
it'll
break
make-
bands up, right?
Well, it could kill you.
Yeah.
So,
Certainly the
but-
stress of
But we had the tunes
psychologically.
going, and he's right. To keep the cost down, we had a friend in the transmission shop create us a dummy speedometer hookup for the transmission. We would unhook the speedometer cable, put this dummy in, so that the truck wouldn't rack up any kilometers or miles, so that we wouldn't have to pay for those. We just paid. We told the place, we need a truck for 3 weeks. We're going camping up north, and then, okay, how many kilometers? Let's say 400. So we'd rack up 400. Next thing you know, we're coming back with like 6,000 kilometers or whatever, but we're not paying for it. 'Cause
Right.
we couldn't afford that.
That's pretty ingenious.
You had to come up with tricks.
Yeah, for sure. But at the end of the tour, you play Canadian Independent Music Festival. Can you tell me about that in Toronto?
Yeah, so somewhere along the lines while we were at West, I got contacted. I phoned in home, and I guess Monica was there, and she said, we got a message, Canadian Independent Music Festival wants to know if Hype will play, but they know we're on tour. Can you be back in time? Turned out it was the very night we were coming back into Toronto. So we said, yeah, we'll play. So it was at, was it at Silver Dollar? I can't remember where it was.
I don't know where.
But I remember,
I don't know it.
I remember we played with False Prophets, the guy with a long fingernail. I don't know what that deal was, but
That's Stefan, yeah.
Yeah, so we showed up and we played the last show, and it had a weird vibe to it, and the band just walked away. I can't say it any more than that. It just
That was Hype's last show?
That was it. The Hype just
Unplanned?
walked away. Unplanned. Everybody just walked away, and they went, that's it. We're done for now.
Because you're alluding to this European tour. Can you tell us you talked about We Bite supporting it, but who else was supposed to be lining? The Spermbirds, right?
Yeah, so we were already deep in discussions on the plan. The plan was we were going to go to Europe in the spring of '89, and that the Spermbirds, who were, I believe, a German band that was on We Bite, was going to be our opening band. And so they were already working on which cities we were going to hit, what the itinerary was going to look like. We were hoping that maybe we could get an EP or something pressed in advance of that.
So you're looking at a new recording.
Yeah, so it was a big deal, and We Bite had advanced us some money for the third tour, and we were thinking about how we were going to get there. It was all going to work out, but the band just dissolved, and it's unfortunate because that would have been a highlight to be able to tour Europe.
Let me ask you about. So we were talking a bit about. I want to go back to Derek's question about your observations on just events and highlights and lowlights of shows.
I think we've got the low light, the Brigade.
Yeah.
Let's
talk about the
from
highlights.
a promoter perspective.
Or are there more low lights?
No.
Okay.
No.
House burning down, the Brigade show. I think we've covered those.
Band breaking up while in the middle of big things happening.
Yeah, exactly.
And
So-
Winnipeg.
And that's when you.
And Winnipeg, yeah.
A
That's
new,
low light.
a new lineup, which is an all-star lineup. There's a lot of things here. Toronto's history seems to be, if only this would have happened. A lot of those stories are. There was a lot of big thinking going on. That
as their manager and the promoter, when the band stops and the musical chair stops, the music stops. Suddenly you realize my name's on all these contracts. I am the face of Hype, and I owe a shitload of money because the money's not being generated. So you're always thinking, okay, well, if we played a show in Toronto, we'd pull in X amount of money, and that'll offset this. And there was a fair amount of money moving through the system at that point. So when the music stopped, the money stopped, and so I was left with a bit of a bill. But I worked through it.
That's good of you.
It's my name. I don't have a choice.
Of course, you don't have a choice. What were your? Do you think your experience in the hardcore scene has helped you inform the person that you are today?
Absolutely.
And in what ways?
I think in my profession today, so I manage people. I think it goes a long way in how I treat people and how I manage people. My views. I mean, I've never changed. Still to this day, if somebody asks me, I said I'm still a punk rocker. I'm socially aware. I think I look at what's happened today, to the world today. And I think about my kids, and I'm concerned because I don't know how things got this far out of whack. Where, the NSA has been proven to be recording everything. People like us have suspected it forever. And it's disclosed, and the world collectively yawns. What the fuck is that? that there's a problem where people are giving up their rights and biometrics and this and that. It's like, this is, AI. I'm not a fan of AI because eventually we're going to, this sounds very science fiction-y, but for me, I think we're heading towards a point where we could be causing our own extinction. There are things that I don't think we should be doing morally. And I see a generation of people that just don't give a damn. They're going, you want my biometrics, you want my information, you want to record me 7/24, what do I care? I'm not doing anything wrong. Yeah, but that's privacy. You shouldn't be doing that. That's something we would have railed against back in our day. And people today going, yeah, sure, have it, Facebook. I'm putting everything, I'm leaving electronic breadcrumbs forever that people will find. I don't know. It's a different, back then we were concerned about the U.S. action in South America and, the Afghan war and all this kind of stuff. But now it's just like, it almost seems like we're under a de facto global control and we don't even know it. And it just sort of creeped in and no one gave a damn. That's just my opinion.
So you talked about the dissolution of hype, and all said and done, what made you walk away from being a promoter or the music scene? Because we all at some point walked away from it.
Yeah.
Right, and everybody walks away for their own particular reason. You had a different view compared to somebody else because you also had a part-time business in this.
Yeah. Well, to be clear, I never made any money on
No.
this.
But it was. But
yeah.
Also to be clear, it was a business.
Yeah. And once hype ended, it was like the soul got ripped out of the whole enterprise. It was like, do I really want to do this anymore? And then it wasn't long after that, broke up with her girlfriend, and everything just changed. It was like a clean sheet time, and you sort of moved on with your life. And I still listen to the music. In fact, people think I'm bizarre because to me, music stopped in 1989 and didn't progress further, unless you're talking New Model Army or something like that. But yeah, my musical genre stops in 1989. I have an extensive iTunes playlist that I just go through over and over again, and that's it. And I don't like the music today, and I don't find it redeeming or valuable. And it's almost like the era ended for me, and maybe it did for United States and Youth and Young Lions, and maybe that was their calling, and we moved on and younger bands took over, and they then took over the scene and then continued to flourish, I imagine. And now every once in a while I'll Google Toronto punk and I see all these bands. Obviously I don't know who the hell these people are, but it's still there. People are still doing stuff. Good for them, but
still alive and well.
Yeah.
But I think they owe something to you.
Yeah. Well, you pass the torch, but people sort of passed the torch to us or got us interested in it. Like if it wasn't for the Clash and their politics, I wouldn't know a ton of stuff about how this world really works, or read Noam Chomsky, or that kind of stuff. That's the match flame that triggers your intellectual curiosity that gets you into all this.
You mentioned the Clash. I know you met Joe Strummer.
I did.
And how did that? Because I remember the day that you met him, and honestly, it's one of those things that kind of clearly you didn't walk down the street; you were floating down the street. You were on cloud 9 meeting that guy.
Yeah, I mean, Joe Strummer was a big hero. I remember the very minute when I found out he died. It was devastating for me. We were outside. I wanted to interview him, or I wanted to interview the Clash for one of the fanzines. I think it was for Reuben's Ramblings. And so we were standing behind Maple Leaf Gardens, and the Clash bus pulled up, and J.D. Roberts was on there finishing an interview with much music. And they got off, and Joe strode right over to me, and he said, "Hey, how you doing? I'm Joe Strummer." I said, "Yeah, I know. I'm from Don. I manage a local punk band, hardcore." And he was like, "That's fantastic. Tell me about it." We were talking about it, and I said, "I'd love to be able to have a chance to interview you guys." And he goes, "No problem." He goes, "Over there, you'll find Cosmo Vinyl. Go talk to Cosmo. He'll get you backstage passes, and he'll get all you guys passes to the show." I said, "Well, we already got tickets." And he goes, "Give them someone else. You're getting primo stuff." And so Cosmo came over and talked to me, and he goes, "All right, man, we'll get you set up." And next thing you know, I'm backstage with the Clash, and Harold Ballard's outside grinding about it's fucking punk rock, and I ended up choosing to interview Paul Simonon. I just thought he was interesting, and you know, I knew all about Joe's thoughts and whatnot. So I interviewed Paul for about an hour on just the Clash, and I think it was in an interview in a fanzine, and it was quite interesting. I mean, I looked up to those guys very much, and
I wonder where that interview is. I'd love
that?
to read it. I'd love to read it.
yeah, it was. I don't know. What was the Barbizon?
Pirates of Doom?
Pirates of Doom. Maybe it was in there. In one of those.
No, I have them both here.
Okay.
It's not here.
Yeah, it was a long interview with the Clash.
Pink
and-
paper.
It was One Solution.
Oh, One Solution? Okay. Yeah. I mean, they were a big, you know, yeah, they went a little mainstream, more than a little, but the stuff they exposed you to and led you down the rabbit hole.
Yeah, for sure. They were a great band. And you were a great promoter, but more than that, you were a great friend of the Toronto hardcore scene. Anyway,